Welcome back, legends. You're at Monkey D. FIC. Another incredible story awaits. What if Dragon trained Luffy from birth and become king of all dragon? Subscribe and hit the bell. Let's dive right in. Chapter 1. The boy the storm brought. The ship was burning by the time Dragon reached the lower decks. He moved through smoke like he was born in it, which in a way, he was. 14 years of revolution had taught him that fire was just weather, something you walked through on the way to something else. Behind him, his lieutenants cleared the corridor with practiced efficiency, two of them dragging a bound world government official toward the extraction point, while the others held the upper deck against the marine reinforcements that had arrived 20 minutes ahead of schedule. 20 minutes. Someone had talked. Dragon filed that away for later and kept moving. The ship was a prisoner transport, one of three that ran the southern route between Marineford and the Great Terminal Processing Facility on Goa. Most people didn't know the processing facility existed. Dragon knew everything about it: the intake numbers, the export routes, the names of the celestial dragons who placed orders through intermediaries who used shell companies that existed only on paper in a building in Marihoa that officially housed the Cartography Guild. He knew all of it, and tonight was supposed to dismantle one thread of that web. Instead, someone had talked, and now the ship was burning, and Dragon was 3 minutes from ordering a full retreat. He kicked open the door at the end of the corridor. The room was a cargo hold converted into temporary cells, iron grating bolted to the walls, each section barely large enough to stand in. Most were empty. The prisoners had already been moved, which meant the Marines had been warned about more than just the timeline. They'd known the target. Dragon stood in the doorway and let the smoke drift past him. His coat shifted in the hot air. He was already calculating the retreat, already composing in his mind the report he'd give Ivankov, already thinking about which among his inner circle had loose enough connections to. He heard it then. A sound that had no business being in a burning cargo hold on a world government slave ship. A baby crying. He found the crate in the far corner, half hidden under a collapsed rack of confiscated weapons. It was a shipping crate, wooden, stenciled with fruit export markings from somewhere in the East Blue, the kind of crate that moved through ports without being looked at twice. Someone had punched holes in the top. Not the Marines. The holes were old, worn at the edges. Someone had done it before the crate was loaded. Dragon pried the top off. The infant inside was maybe 8 months old, round-faced and dark-haired, wrapped in a piece of sailcloth that had once been red. He was screaming with the full commitment of someone who had been screaming for a very long time and had decided that volume was the only available solution. His face was red and scrunched and furious, and when Dragon's shadow fell over him, he stopped, looked up with enormous dark eyes, and then screamed louder. Dragon stared at him. From the upper deck, he heard Emporio Ivankov's voice calling down through the smoke, something about the portside ladder, and 3 minutes before the second Marine ship came alongside. Dragon heard all of it. He registered the timeline, the escape window, the acceptable losses, the operational math that had governed every decision he'd made for 14 years. He picked the baby up. It was not a decision he made consciously. His hands moved before his mind caught up with them, lifting the child out of the crate with the particular careful instinct of someone who had been around babies before, long ago, in a different life. The infant grabbed his finger with both hands and kept screaming, but quieter now, more conversational, as if the screaming had been a negotiating position and physical contact was an acceptable counteroffer. There was a tag tied around the baby's wrist. A piece of cloth, letters written in a hand that had been shaking or rushing or both. Dragon read it once. Then read it twice. Monkey D. Luffy. Keep him safe. Poor Gas D. Rouge. Dragon knew that name. Everyone in the upper reaches of the revolution knew that name, if only because they knew the name of the man she'd been connected to, Gold Roger, the Pirate King. Roger's bloodline. Roger's child. Which meant this infant, currently attempting to eat Dragon's finger with 4 teeth and the determination of someone who had never failed at anything, was simultaneously the most politically significant baby in the world and the most hunted. He thought about Garp. He thought about the Great Terminal. He thought about what happened to children who carried dangerous bloodlines when the world government found them first. He thought about a lot of things very quickly, standing in a burning cargo hold with smoke in his lungs and his lieutenants calling his name from the deck above. Then he tucked the baby inside his coat, climbed the ladder, and walked off the burning ship like he'd planned the whole thing from the beginning. Ivankov took one look at the small dark-haired head poking out from Dragon's coat, and said nothing. Ivankov had survived 30 years of the most chaotic life imaginable and had developed, through sheer necessity, the ability to recognize moments that did not benefit from commentary. The extraction team moved. Dragon moved with them. Behind them, the ship burned down to the waterline. Moonscar was not on any map. That was by design. It existed in that category of places the Grand Line sometimes produced, islands that sat in the gaps between weather systems, tucked into the blind spots of log poses and the uncharted margins of official cartography. The Revolutionary Army had held it for 6 years, long enough to build real structures into the rock face, to plant gardens in the volcanic soil, to establish the rhythms of a small, self-sufficient community that happened to also be training the most dangerous collection of fighters in the world. It was, Dragon had always thought, a terrible place to raise a child. Luffy thrived in it immediately. By the time he could walk, he had figured out that the training yards were the most interesting place on the island, and that the best way to access them was through a gap in the eastern fence that even the adult trainees didn't know about. He had no fear of the sparring that happened there. He would walk directly into the middle of a full-contact drill and stand watching with his mouth open and his eyes wide, and experienced fighters twice his size would instinctively stop what they were doing and try not to accidentally step on him. Dragon watched this from a distance and said nothing. He was not a natural father. He knew this without self-pity, the way he knew a lot of things about himself, factually, without dwelling. He was precise and focused and driven by something so enormous and long-term that it didn't leave much room for the small immediate things, the daily texture of a child's needs. He hired people for that. There was a woman named B, a former Navy medic who had come over to the Revolution 3 years ago, who managed Luffy's meals and sleep and the rotating collection of minor injuries that seemed to accumulate around the boy like weather. There was Ivankov, who was completely unqualified to supervise children and did it anyway with tremendous enthusiasm and only occasionally needed to be stopped. And there was Dragon himself, who sat at the edge of the training yards in the evenings and watched his son play and did not know what he was supposed to feel. What he felt, when he was honest with himself, which he tried to be, because dishonesty was a luxury he couldn't afford, was something very close to fear. Not of the world government finding them, though that was a constant calculation. The fear was smaller and sharper than that. It was the fear of looking at this ridiculous, fearless, laughing child and understanding that there was now something in the world that could stop him. Something that could be used against him. Something that, if he wasn't careful, could become the thing that undid everything. He kept waiting for the feeling to go away. It didn't. By the time Luffy was 3, he had decided that Dragon was his favorite person on Moonscar, a decision he announced loudly and regularly, and seemed genuinely baffled that Dragon didn't respond to with equivalent enthusiasm. By 4, he had learned the names and abilities of every trainee and lieutenant on the island, catalogued them with the instinctive memory of someone who found people genuinely fascinating, and had developed strong opinions about which of them would win in a fight against which other of them. Bello Betty would beat Morley, he told Dragon one evening, very seriously, eating a piece of mango on the steps outside Dragon's office. Because Morley's too slow at the start and Betty gets people fired up and she just used that. Dragon looked at him. Betty's ability works on other people's fighting spirit. It wouldn't help her against Morley directly. Yeah, but Morley doesn't want to fight Betty. He likes her. Luffy took another bite of mango. So she'd just make him embarrassed, and he'd mess up. Dragon was quiet for a moment. That's a perceptive observation. What's perceptive? It means you notice something real. Luffy grinned at him with mango juice on his chin, enormous and uncomplicated, and Dragon felt that small sharp fear again and looked away. The Gomu Gomu no Mi arrived on the island inside a cache of seized cargo that one of the army's western cells had liberated from a world government vessel, one of a dozen devil fruits that moved through the cache, catalogued for distribution or trade. Dragon's intelligence officer had flagged the Gomu Gomu as low tactical priority. Paramecia, no offensive application, primarily a curiosity. Dragon had agreed with that assessment, and left it in the storage inventory. He had not, he realized later, specifically told Luffy not to go into the storage inventory. This was, in retrospect, an error. He was in a meeting with 3 of his cell leaders when Koala came running in with the expression of someone who had been asked to deliver news that they absolutely did not want to deliver. She was 12 and already one of the most competent people on the island, which was why Dragon had assigned her to the administrative rotation. She stood in the doorway, looked at Dragon, and said very carefully, "There has been a development with Luffy." Dragon excused himself from the meeting. He found his son in the courtyard outside the storage building, sitting cross-legged on the ground, staring at his own arm with an expression of pure scientific fascination. The arm was stretched, extended about 4 feet beyond where arms were supposed to end, pulled taut like a rubber band, Luffy's fingers splayed out and examining themselves with enormous interest. "Huh," Luffy said. Dragon crouched down in front of him. He looked at the arm. He looked at his son's face. He said very evenly, "You ate the fruit." "It was in a bowl," Luffy said defensively. "The other fruit in the bowl wasn't magic. The other fruit in the bowl was regular fruit. The bowl is in a storage facility that you were not supposed to enter." Luffy pulled his arm back. It snapped back with a sound like a rubber band releasing, Luffy yelping slightly at the speed of it, then starting to laugh. He stretched it out again, slower this time, watching the way the skin moved. He was 5 years old and utterly delighted and had absolutely no idea that he just changed both their lives. Dragon sat back on his heels and looked at the sky. The Gomu Gomu no Mi rubber properties, full body application, immunity to blunt force and electricity. Low tactical priority, the report had said. Dragon had agreed. He'd been wrong. He looked at his son stretching both arms out simultaneously, laughing at himself, and began, slowly and with great precision, to revise every training plan he had ever made. The training started the next morning. Not immediately brutal. Dragon understood children, or understood enough about them to know that brutality before foundation building was just damage. He started with the fundamentals. Stamina. Flexibility. Body awareness. The training that any fighter needed before anything else, adapted for a 5-year-old body that could stretch and compress in ways human bodies weren't supposed to. Luffy's relationship with training was complicated. He didn't hate it. He couldn't hate anything for long. His attention was too restless, his enthusiasm too immediate. He complained, loudly and constantly, about being hungry and tired and about how BA's soup was better than everything else in the world and they should stop training and go have some. He fell asleep during meditation exactly once, snoring so completely and immediately that even Dragon had to look away to keep his expression in order. He argued about every drill that seemed boring to him, with a directness that most people took for rudeness until they realized he genuinely just wanted to know why. "Why do I have to run the cliff path again?" he demanded on the 4th morning, hands on his knees, breathing hard. "I already know I'm tired." "You don't run it to find out if you're tired," Dragon said. "You run it to move the line of when tired becomes unable." Luffy considered this. "What if I make my legs longer so the path is shorter?" "The path isn't the point. The work is the point." "That's a confusing way to explain it." "Run the path." Fiyin. But he ran it. He always ran it eventually, grumbling and dramatic about it, but he ran it. And somewhere in the first year of training, Dragon noticed something that he had not expected and did not know what to do with. Luffy learned faster when he was having fun. Not just physically. Conceptually. If Dragon explained a strategy as a puzzle, as a game, as something to figure out rather than memorize, Luffy absorbed it with startling speed and then immediately started testing its limits, pushing at the edges of what the strategy was supposed to do until he found the cracks and started filling them with his own ideas. Those ideas were frequently insane. They were also, more often than Dragon was comfortable with, correct. By 7, Luffy could run the cliff path without losing his breath, stretch his body in 12 distinct combat applications, and had developed an instinctive understanding of spatial distance that his rubber body made almost supernatural. He could feel the space around him the way other people felt temperature, a constant ambient sense of where everything was, how far, how fast it was moving. He was also, without question, the most difficult person Dragon had ever tried to teach anything to. "You dropped your guard on the left," Dragon said for the 3rd time in an hour. "I know," Luffy said, bouncing back up from the mat where Dragon had knocked him down. "But I was trying something." "What were you trying?" "I wanted to see if I could stretch back fast enough that your punch went through me." Dragon looked at him. "That's not in the curriculum." "It worked though." Luffy was grinning, rubbing the back of his head. "Mostly. You still got hit. The second time I didn't." This was technically true. Dragon thought about it for a moment, recalibrated, and said, "Show me again." Luffy lit up like he'd been given a gift. That was the dynamic they fell into. Dragon providing the structure, the foundation, the tactical framework that decades of revolution had built in him, and Luffy immediately testing every boundary of that framework with the instinctive creativity of someone who couldn't conceive of a rule that shouldn't be questioned. It should have been maddening. Dragon kept waiting for it to become maddening. Instead, it was the most interesting problem he'd encountered in years. Sabo arrived on Moonscar when Luffy was 8. He came the way many people came to the revolution, through disaster. He'd been found by one of the army's eastern cells in the wreckage of a noble's yacht, sole survivor, half drowned, with burns on his hands and a specific kind of calm behind his eyes that people developed when they'd seen something they weren't going to recover from quickly. The cell leader who brought him in had written in her report, 11 years old. Noble background, clearly. Refuses to say from where. Useful intelligence on Goa Kingdom internal politics. Intelligent. Recommend observation. Dragon read the report and authorized the placement. Luffy found Sabo on his first full day on the island, which was not difficult because Luffy found everyone on their first full day. He had a system. He was deeply committed to it. Sabo was sitting on the eastern wall looking at the sea, and Luffy climbed up and sat next to him and said, "What's your name?" Sabo looked at him. "Sabo. I'm Luffy. Can you fight?" "What? Can you fight?" "Because I need someone to train with who's closer to my size. Dad keeps knocking me down, but when I try stuff on the others they just stop and look at me weird." Sabo stared at him for a long moment. He had the look of someone who had grown up in a world where children didn't speak to strangers like this, where directness was considered rude and familiarity had to be earned through layers of formality. He looked at Luffy's complete lack of any of those social instincts, and seemed genuinely thrown by it. "I know some basics," he said finally. Luffy grinned. "Great. Come on." That was that. Sabo was, it turned out, more than some basics. His noble upbringing had included martial training of the formal variety, structured, precise, built on a foundation of actual theory. What he lacked was experience in anything that didn't follow the rules, which meant that the first time Luffy stretched his arm around Sabo's guard and flicked him in the ear from 4 feet away, Sabo's entire understanding of combat took a moment to catch up with what had just happened. He adapted fast. That was the thing about Sabo. He was quick, not just in his body but in his mind, and he learned by watching and then immediately building on what he'd seen. Within a week of training with Luffy he developed 3 counter-strategies for rubber body attacks, which he explained to Luffy in careful detail before attempting them. "Why are you telling me what you're going to do?" Luffy asked, genuinely baffled. "Because I want to see if they work even when you know they're coming," Sabo said. Luffy thought about this. "That's actually really smart." "I know." They became brothers in the way children become brothers, completely, immediately, and with the particular intensity of 2 people who had each, in their different ways, been lonely before and recognized in the other someone who made the world make more sense. Sabo was sharp where Luffy was instinctive, careful where Luffy was reckless, methodical where Luffy treated every plan as a starting point for improvisation. Dragon observed this and said nothing. But he began including Sabo in some of Luffy's training sessions, and in the evenings he sometimes watched the two of them sparring in the courtyard. Sabo's precise footwork against Luffy's elastic chaos, with the expression of a man revising his models of the world. Ivankov, who watched Dragon watching the boys one evening, leaned over and said very quietly, "You're proud of him." "I'm assessing his progress," Dragon said. Ivankov smiled. "Of course you are, Dragon boy." Dragon said nothing. But he watched until the boys stopped training and collapsed dramatically in the grass, arguing about who had won and whether winning even meant anything if Luffy kept making up new rules. That night, he revised Luffy's training curriculum again. The boy was 8. He was already operating at a level that some of the Army's junior fighters took years to reach. His rubber body gave him defensive capability that was almost entirely passive, which meant his offensive power was the real variable. And his offensive power, Dragon was beginning to understand, was going to be determined not by how hard he could hit but by how creatively he could use what he was. Dragon started teaching him about hockey. Not the mechanics first, the theory. The philosophy, as much as Dragon had one about it, which was less mystical than most teachers offered. "Hockey is will expressed as force," he told Luffy one morning, sitting across from him in the small room Dragon used for these sessions. "Your will is already large. Your problem is that it moves like water, it takes the shape of whatever container you put it in. For hockey, you need it to move like a fist." Luffy chewed on this literally as well as figuratively. He was eating something throughout most conversations, a habit Dragon had stopped trying to correct. "What's the container?" "Fear. Anger. Strong emotion." Dragon watched him. "What do you feel when you're fighting?" Luffy looked surprised by the question, like he'd never thought about it. "Happy," he said. "Mostly happy. Sometimes excited. Like, something big is happening and I'm in it." Dragon was quiet for a moment. "That's unusual." "Is that bad?" "No," Dragon said. And something in his voice when he said it made Luffy look at him curiously, because Dragon didn't use that tone often, the tone of someone who meant something more than the word they were saying. "It's not bad at all." Luffy went back to eating. Dragon looked out the window at the morning. He thought about what he'd found in a crate on a burning ship 8 years ago. He thought about the tag on the baby's wrist and a woman named Rouge who had died to keep her son alive long enough to be found. He thought about what he had built on this island and what he intended to build with it, and the long cold shape of the future he was working toward. Then he thought about his son saying happy, with absolute certainty, like it was the most obvious answer in the world. Dragon had spent 14 years being fueled by something that was the opposite of happy. Something cold and sharp and heavy, righteous in the way a blade is righteous, because it was useful, not because it was good. He had made peace with that. The revolution needed what he was. But Luffy was going to be something else. Dragon could see that now with the same clarity he saw strategy, not wishful thinking, not projection, just the plain observation of a man who had studied power his entire adult life. Luffy was going to be something the world had never seen. Not because of his devil fruit. Not because of what Dragon could train into him. Because of that. Because of happy said like it was obvious, said like fighting and joy were the same word. Dragon stood up and said, "We'll start hockey exercises tomorrow. Today I want to show you something." Luffy was on his feet immediately, because that sentence, in Dragon's voice, always meant something real was coming. He followed his father out of the room and down the corridor and out the back of the main building into the morning, and they walked together across the island toward the western cliffs where the rock face dropped 60 feet into the sea. Dragon stopped at the edge and pointed down. Below them, in the rock face, there was a cave entrance. Not hidden, exactly, but easy to miss, the kind of opening that looked like a crack in the rock until you knew what you were looking for. Dragon had never shown it to anyone on the island. Not Ivankov. Not Koala. Not his cell leaders. Luffy looked at it, then looked at Dragon. What's in there? Dragon looked at the cave for a moment. He thought about the answer, not because he didn't know it, but because some things changed irrevocably when you said them out loud. Something that was waiting for someone, he said finally. I thought it was waiting for me. But it wasn't. Dragon looked at his son. 8 years old, dark-haired, wearing a straw hat he'd traded a week's dessert rations for because he'd seen it on a trader passing through and had simply needed it. Looking back at Dragon with those enormous dark eyes that had been screaming in a burning cargo hold and were now asking questions with the directness that made most adults uncomfortable. I don't know yet, Dragon said. But I think you should see it. They climbed down the cliff face together, Dragon moving efficiently, Luffy stretching his arms between the handholds like it was a game. The cave entrance was narrow, and inside it opened up into something much larger, a natural cavern that went deep into the rock, lit from somewhere below by a faint blue-green glow that wasn't bioluminescence, and wasn't fire, and wasn't anything Dragon had been able to identify in 4 years of trying. Luffy went still when he saw the light. That was the remarkable thing. Luffy went still, not frozen, not scared, but quiet in a way Dragon almost never saw. Like something in him had recognized something. What is that? Luffy said, barely above a whisper. Come and see, Dragon said. They went deeper into the cave, and the light grew, and at the center of the deepest chamber it was waiting, the thing Dragon had found 4 years ago, and had never been able to explain and had guarded like the most dangerous secret he possessed. The thing he had touched and felt nothing. The thing that had sat unchanged for 4 years and was now, as Luffy walked toward it, beginning to pulse. Luffy reached out his hand. Dragon said nothing. The light expanded. Later, when the island had settled back into its evening rhythms and the pulse of blue-green light had faded from the cave, Dragon sat in his office with the door closed and thought about what he'd seen. Luffy came in without knocking, which was also normal. He sat in the chair across from Dragon's desk and looked at his own hand, the one that had touched the light, with that same expression of scientific fascination he'd had when he first stretched his arm 5 feet and stared at it. I could feel something, Luffy said. Like something waking up. Yes. What is it? Dragon looked at his son. He thought about how to explain it. The months of research, the ancient texts his intelligence network had eventually located, the lineage it described that was older than the world government, and maybe older than the first kings. The dragon's throne. The inheritance. The weight of it. He thought about all of that, and then he looked at Luffy's face, curious, open, completely unafraid, and said, It's a responsibility. Luffy considered that for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, like he was filing it away. Okay, he said. Can I have dinner now? Dragon's mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile. Nothing Dragon did was quite a smile. Go get dinner, he said. Luffy got up, knocked over the chair accidentally, picked it back up, said, Sorry, and left. Dragon looked at the chair. He looked at the closed door. He looked at the papers on his desk, reports, logistics, the endless operational machinery of the revolution. Then he looked at nothing for a while. His son was going to change the world. Not the way Dragon intended to change it, not with strategy and patience, and the long, cold work of dismantling what existed. Something faster. Louder. More like a natural disaster than a revolution. Dragon thought about that. Then he opened the top report, and went back to work. Outside, Luffy was running across the courtyard toward the mess hall, yelling something at Sabo, already laughing about something Dragon couldn't hear. His straw hat flew off his head and he caught it without looking back, slapping it on as he ran. The evening came down over Moonscar like a blanket. In the cave below the western cliff, the blue-green light pulsed once in the darkness. Then it went still, and waited. Chapter 2, The Dragon's Throne. The dream started 3 days after Luffy touched the light. Not nightmares, Dragon checked, because nightmares in children were something B had told him to watch for, something about stress response and psychological load. But Luffy didn't wake screaming. He woke quietly, which was somehow more unusual. Luffy did nothing quietly. He sat up in his bunk in the pre-dawn dark with his eyes already open, staring at the ceiling with that expression he got when he was working something out, the one that looked like concentration but was actually closer to listening. The third morning, Dragon was in the corridor when Luffy emerged from his room, and Luffy looked up at him and said, without preamble, "I keep seeing mountains. Really old ones. And something flying over them that I can't see clearly." Dragon said, "What does it feel like?" Luffy thought about it. "Like remembering something I've never seen." Dragon sent him to breakfast and then went to his private library, a room that technically didn't exist on any record of the island's infrastructure, and pulled out the oldest of the texts his network had located. He'd read them dozens of times. He read them again now, looking for something different, looking for what happened to someone who touched the throne and was accepted by it. The texts were incomplete, as most important things were. But they were clear on one point. The throne didn't activate for just anyone. It had been created in an age the world government had spent centuries erasing from history, the age before the Void Century, or possibly during it, when the boundaries between devil fruit power and something more fundamental had been different, more permeable. The dragon lineage the texts described wasn't metaphorical. It was a real power, ancient and particular, that had been waiting for the right inheritor since the last of its line had died in a war that no history book mentioned. Dragon had found the throne 4 years ago during a covert operation on Moonscar's lower levels. He touched it himself, out of operational necessity. He needed to know what it was before he could decide what to do with it. He'd felt nothing. Not rejection, exactly. Just silence. The particular silence of something that had looked at him and decided he wasn't the answer to its question. He'd been honest enough with himself about that. He'd also been honest enough to recognize, watching his 8-year-old son walk toward the pulsing light with something like recognition on his face, that the waiting was over. The question now was what it meant. What it would do to the Gomu Gomu no Mi. What it would do to Luffy. He didn't have those answers yet. So he watched, and waited, and revised the training curriculum for the 3rd time in 3 years. Sabo found out about the cave the way Sabo found out about most things, by following Luffy at a careful distance, and not saying anything until he had enough information to be useful. "You're going back," he said one morning, falling into step beside Luffy as he headed toward the western cliff. Not accusing. Just observational. "I go every morning," Luffy said. "I know. I followed you twice." Luffy looked at him. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I was deciding if I should." Sabo kept walking. He was 9, precise and self-contained in the way that children raised in formal environments sometimes are, not cold, exactly, just economical with himself, like he'd learned early that spending too much of himself at once was dangerous. He looked at Luffy sideways. "What's down there?" Luffy was quiet for a moment, which for Luffy was practically a medical event. Then he said, "Something that feels like mine." Sabo considered that. He'd lived on Moonscar for 6 months now and he'd learned a few reliable things, one of which was that Luffy said exactly what he meant, always, without decoration. If Luffy said it felt like his, then the thing felt like his. "Does Dragon know you go every morning?" "He walks down with me sometimes." "So he knows." "Yeah." Sabo nodded slowly. "Okay." They reached the cliff's edge. Luffy stretched one arm down to a handhold and swung himself over without hesitation, already moving, the descent casual and comfortable the way things became comfortable after enough repetition. Sabo followed him the proper way, hands and feet, careful but quick. The cave was different this time. Or rather the light was different, steadier than Sabo had expected from Luffy's description, less like a pulse and more like breathing. A slow, deep, rhythmic glow that filled the cavern with something that wasn't quite illumination so much as presence. Sabo stood at the chamber entrance and felt the hair on his arms stand up, which was new. He was not an especially dramatic person. Luffy walked to the center of the chamber and sat down cross-legged in front of the source of the light, an object Sabo could now see clearly for the first time. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Something dramatic, probably. Something imposing. What he saw instead was a stone platform, roughly hewn, maybe 3 feet high and 5 feet wide, and on its surface a formation of crystals that had grown together into a shape that was almost organic, almost like a coiled thing at rest. The light came from inside the crystal, from somewhere deep in it that didn't correspond to any light source. It looked, Sabo thought, exactly like what it apparently was. Old beyond reckoning, patient beyond patience, waiting. Luffy put his hand on the crystal and the light changed. It moved toward him. Not physically, the crystal didn't shift, but the light oriented, the way a plant orients toward the sun. It reached for Luffy like he was something it recognized. Sabo watched, very still, his analytical mind cataloging everything and his instincts telling him that whatever this was, it was not small. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "No," Luffy said. His voice was different in here, not quieter, exactly, but more focused. "It's warm." "Like?" He trailed off, searching for it. "You know, after you've been swimming in cold water and you come out and the sun hits you? That kind of warm." "What does it do?" "I don't know yet." Luffy opened his eyes and looked at the crystal. "But it's learning me. And I'm learning it." Sabo sat down on the cave floor, wrapped his arms around his knees, and decided to wait. This was one of the things that made him a good partner to Luffy. He knew when watching was the job. He watched for 2 hours while Luffy sat with his hand on the crystal and the light moved between them in patterns that Sabo didn't have the framework to interpret. When Luffy finally pulled his hand back and stood up, he looked the same. That was both reassuring and somehow alarming, because Sabo had the feeling that something significant had just happened and there should be more evidence of it. "Same time tomorrow?" Sabo asked. Luffy grinned at him. "Same time tomorrow." Dragon started them on hockey that week. Real hockey work, not the theoretical groundwork he'd been laying for a year. He began with observation, Kanbunshiku, because it built on awareness that Luffy's rubber body had already been developing naturally, that ambient sense of space and movement that Dragon had noticed 2 years ago. "Close your eyes," Dragon said. They were in the main training yard, mid-morning, the island's perpetual crosswind moving through. Sabo stood off to the side observing. Dragon had made a quiet decision to include Sabo in these sessions, because Sabo's presence sharpened Luffy's focus in a way that Dragon's presence alone didn't. Luffy performed differently with an audience he cared about. Not showing off, something more than that. Something about having a witness made the work feel real to him. Luffy closed his eyes. "Tell me when I move," Dragon said. He stood still for 15 seconds. Then he shifted his weight to his left foot. "Left," Luffy said immediately. Dragon was quiet. Then he shifted his weight back, and stepped forward 2 inches. "Forward," Luffy said. "Small." Dragon had not expected that. He kept his expression neutral. Again. Eyes closed. He moved in complete silence for the next 5 minutes, small shifts, repositions, weight transfers, and Luffy called each one. Not every time. He missed 2, both times Dragon moved when a gust of wind crossed the yard, the sound masking whatever signal Luffy was reading. But he hit 8 out of 10, and the 2 he missed he knew he missed. "The wind threw me off," he said, frustrated. "There was too much noise." "Note that," Dragon said. "Your observation right now reads physical signals, air displacement, sound, the space your targets occupy. When you develop it further, you'll read intention. At that level, the wind is irrelevant." Luffy opened his eyes. "How long does that take? For most people? Years. For me?" Dragon looked at him. "Months if you stop sleeping through the morning meditation." "I don't sleep through it, you snored." "I was resting my eyes." Sabo made a sound from the sideline that he immediately converted into a cough. Dragon turned to Sabo. "Your turn." Sabo stood up immediately, which was one of the things Dragon appreciated about him. He came to attention like a professional, no argument, no performance. He closed his eyes. Dragon moved. Sabo was slower than Luffy, more methodical, reading the signals in sequence rather than all at once. He missed 4 and 10. But the ones he caught with precise analytical confidence, and when he reported them he described why he'd sensed what he sensed, which was actually more advanced behavior than just sensing it. He was building the theory as he practiced the skill. In 5 years, Dragon thought, Sabo would be exceptional. In 5 years, Luffy would be something that didn't have a clean category. He drove them hard that week. Both boys, full training days, morning runs, midday sparring, afternoon hockey sessions, evening theory. Luffy complained about all of it except the sparring, which he loved with the straightforward wholeness of someone who had found his natural element. Sabo complained about nothing except the morning runs, and only silently, in the set of his jaw that Dragon had learned to read. On the 4th day, something changed in the hockey sessions. They were running the observation drills again, Dragon moving while both boys tracked him with closed eyes. Standard. Luffy had improved to 9 out of 10 over the previous days, and Dragon had begun adding lateral movement, more complexity, trying to stay ahead of the boys' development. He moved to Luffy's left flank, fast, silent. Luffy's eyes snapped open. He turned, not toward where Dragon was but toward the cave beneath the western cliff, which was 200 feet and a rock face away. What? Luffy said. Dragon stopped. What do you feel? Something moved, Luffy said, frowning. In the cave. Something big. Dragon said carefully. There's nothing in the cave. Something moved, Luffy said again, absolutely certain. Dragon looked at him for a long moment. Then he dismissed the afternoon sessions, told Sabo to run conditioning on his own until dinner, and took Luffy to the cliff. The cave was different. Dragon had been down twice in the past week and it had been as he'd left it. The crystal formation on its platform, the quiet light, the particular stillness of very old things at rest. Now the light was brighter, not the slow breath rhythm Luffy had described but something faster, something urgent. And around the crystal formation, on the stone floor of the chamber, there were marks that had not been there before. Not carved. Not drawn. Grown, like frost patterns on glass, spreading from the base of the platform in lines that followed an organic logic Dragon didn't have the vocabulary for. They were warm to the touch. He pressed 2 fingers to the nearest one and pulled back, not pain, but something like voltage. A current. Luffy stood beside him and looked at the marks with that listening expression. It's ready, he said. For what? I don't know. He looked at Dragon. But I think I have to go all the way in. All the way in, Dragon repeated. I've been putting my hand on it. But that's just touching it from outside. Luffy looked at the crystal, and Dragon watched his son's face in the pulsing light, 8 years old, round-cheeked, wearing his straw hat in a cave because he wore his straw hat everywhere. Looking at the most ancient thing either of them had ever stood near like it was a friend he hadn't properly introduced himself to yet. I think I have to let it actually come in. Dragon was quiet for a long time. He thought about what the text said. About the nature of the dragon lineage power, not a devil fruit, not hockey, something that predated those frameworks. Something that bonded to its inheritor completely, not as a tool but as a second nature. The texts were not specific about what that process looked like. They were very specific about the fact that it was irreversible. If I say no, Dragon said, you'll wait. It wasn't a question. He knew his son. Luffy would wait if Dragon said so, not forever, and not without arguing about it, but he would wait if Dragon gave him a reason he respected. Luffy looked at him. Is there a reason to wait? Dragon looked at the crystal. At the marks on the floor. At the light that had been breathing in this cave for 4 years while he built a revolution overhead, and wondered what he was supposed to do with what he'd found. He thought about a burning ship. He thought about a tag on a baby's wrist. He thought about a woman named Rouge who had never had the chance to see who her son was going to be. No, Dragon said quietly. There isn't. Luffy sat down in front of the crystal. Not cross-legged this time, he sat back on his heels, both palms flat on the platform on either side of the formation, his forehead almost touching it. Like a bow, Dragon thought. Like something between a greeting and a surrender. The light went white. Dragon stepped back, not from fear, from the instinct of someone who understood that some processes didn't need interference, only witness. He stood at the edge of the chamber and watched. The white light expanded until the cave had no walls, or the walls didn't matter, and in the center of it Luffy was a silhouette with his head down. The marks on the floor blazed and then stopped being marks. They were lines of force, of something, connecting to Luffy from every direction, from the crystal and from the walls and from something below the floor that Dragon couldn't see. He felt his own haki responding to it, his conqueror's haki, the thing he'd spent years learning to control, rose in his chest like a reflex, and he had to consciously push it down. Luffy made a sound. Not pain. Dragon checked, his hands clenched at his sides, and he checked, the way he'd spent 8 years checking on his son without being obvious about it. Not pain. Something more like the sound of someone surfacing from underwater, the gasp of breath after pressure. Then the light began to change. White became gold. Gold became something that wasn't a color Dragon had a word for, something that moved the way light didn't normally move, something that had texture and weight and heat that he felt on his face from 20 feet away. And in the center of it, Luffy's silhouette shifted. Not physically, his body was the same, but the outline of him, the shape of his presence in Dragon's haki sense, expanded enormously. Not like a person expanding. Like a landscape. Like something that had been folded very small for a very long time unfolding to its actual size. Dragon breathed slowly through it. After what might have been 20 minutes or 2 hours, the light contracted. Came back to itself. Settled into the crystal formation's quiet pulse, slower now, the breathing rhythm restored. The marks on the floor were gone. The voltage was gone. Luffy sat on his heels with his head down, and his hands still flat on the platform. Dragon walked to him. Crouched down. Looked at his son's face. Luffy's eyes were closed. His expression was something Dragon had never seen on him. Not peaceful, exactly, though there was peace in it. Grounded. Like a tree that had just put its roots down fully and felt the whole earth through them for the first time. When he opened his eyes, they were his own eyes, dark, direct, enormous. No glow. No transformation. Nothing dramatic. Just Luffy, looking at his father. "Are you all right?" Dragon asked. Luffy smiled. It was the same smile. The laughing, uncomplicated, completely present smile that Dragon had spent 8 years being quietly undone by. "Yeah," Luffy said. "I think I'm really okay." The changes were not immediate. That was the first thing Dragon noted. No overnight transformation, no morning when Luffy woke up able to do things he hadn't been able to do the day before. The power that had entered him was not additive. It was more fundamental than that. It changed the architecture. Within 2 weeks, his haki development moved from months ahead of schedule to something Dragon didn't have a schedule for. The observation that had been sensing air displacement became something else. He could feel the island. Not just the people on it, but the island itself, the movement of water underground and the shift of rock in the wind, and be going to the kitchen at 4 in the morning because she couldn't sleep. He sat at breakfast one morning and said, "Someone's coming. From the west. 2 ships. Not ours." Dragon had already received the alert from his lookouts. He looked at his son across the breakfast table. "How far?" Luffy squinted. 4 hours? The lookout report said 3.5. The boy's range wasn't perfect yet. But the fact that he had range at all, that his observation had expanded from the training yard to the entire island without formal instruction, without Dragon telling him how, that was new. The Busashoka came differently than it did for most people. Dragon had seen 100 fighters develop armament haki over the years, the way it started as a darkening of the skin in the area of focus, how beginners could only hold it in one place for a few seconds. Luffy developed it by accident in a sparring match 3 weeks after the cave. He was fighting 2 of the army's senior trainees simultaneously. A drilled dragon ran to pressure him into using the space his rubber body created, and one of the trainees landed a solid hit on his midsection, solid enough that it should have knocked him back. Luffy didn't move. The trainee looked at his fist. Luffy looked down at himself. The strike point was dark, the specific darkness of armament hockey, and it hadn't been dark a second ago. I felt that coming, Luffy said, mostly to himself. Dragon stopped the drill. He walked onto the mat and looked at the darkening on Luffy's side. Can you do it deliberately? Luffy frowned at his own arm. He concentrated. Dragon watched the effort, the internal reaching, and after 6 seconds the skin along his forearm went dark. Clean, solid armament, better formed than most first attempts. It held for 4 seconds and then faded. Again, Dragon said. Luffy did it again. 3 seconds this time, but he got there faster. Again. They spent the rest of the morning on nothing else. By afternoon, Luffy could coat his full arm in 3 seconds and hold it for 15. By the following week, the entire upper body in 5 seconds. The Dragon Throne hadn't given him the haki, that wasn't how it worked. But it had changed the depth of his will, the reach of it, and haki was will. Building on a deeper foundation, it grew faster. Sabo watched all of this with the expression of someone who found things genuinely interesting even when those things were making his own progress look comparatively slow. He was developing his own haki on the standard timeline, which was still ahead of most people his age, and he had the good sense to see Luffy's acceleration not as a judgment on him, but as a data point. What does it feel like? He asked Luffy one evening. The throne thing. They were sitting on the eastern wall after dinner, watching the water. It was the kind of evening Moonscar did well, orange and gold, the sea flat and metallic, the crosswind gentle to something almost pleasant. Luffy thought about it seriously. He took Sabo's questions seriously, always, because Sabo asked the real ones. Like I'm standing somewhere higher, he said finally. Like I can see more from where I am. But I'm still me, you know? It's not like something else came in. It's more like, part of me that was really small got big. Sabo nodded slowly. The text Dragon has, the ones in the locked room, you know about those? I read upside down quickly when I was walking past his desk. Luffy stared at him. Then started laughing. What did they say? Not much. They mentioned something called the Dragon King. The last one died a long time ago. Sabo looked at Luffy sidelong. They also mentioned that the power builds continuously. That there's no ceiling the text could describe. Luffy seemed to consider this. He stretched one arm out absently, let it reach 20 feet over the water, then snapped it back. Dragon thinks I'll be able to manifest, he said. Manifest what? Luffy opened his mouth. Closed it. I don't have a good word for it. Something that was in the cave. I could feel it, not the crystal, something in the crystal. Something that's been in there for a really long time. He looked at his hands. Dragon thinks when my haki gets strong enough it'll come out. Whatever it is. Sabo was quiet for a moment. Are you scared? No, Luffy said, immediately and completely. Sabo looked at him, at the absolute certainty of it, the way Luffy said it like fear hadn't even presented itself as an option. He shook his head slowly. You know, most people would be at least a little scared. Why? Luffy stretched his arm out again, watching the evening light on his skin. It's mine. Why would I be scared of something that's mine? Sabo had no answer for that. He looked at the water. After a while he said, I want to learn haki faster. I know, Luffy said. Can you feel when it's working? When mine is. Yeah, Luffy said. Your observation is almost there. You get this, I don't know, it feels like a color. When you're really focused it goes sharp. Sabo turned to him. You can feel other people's haki developing? Luffy blinked. Can't everyone? No, Sabo said very slowly. Luffy, no. That is not something everyone can do. Luffy looked genuinely surprised. Then he started laughing. Not the normal laugh, the one that happened when the world turned out to be more interesting than expected. Oh, he said. Huh. Sabo dragged both hands down his face. Right, he said. Okay. Fine. What does mine feel like right now? Blue, Luffy said immediately. Kind of dark blue. Moving like water. Sabo dropped his hands and looked at the ocean. He thought about that for a while. That's actually kind of nice, he said. Dragon called Luffy to his office 6 weeks after the cave. Not the training room, not the yard, the office, which meant it was something that required full attention and a level of formality that Dragon occasionally remembered to maintain. Luffy sat across the desk. He'd grown again. There was a summer growth spurt happening that he had noted with the particular satisfaction of someone responsible for adequate nutrition, and he looked less like a small child and more like the early edge of what he was going to be. Taller. Straighter in the shoulders. He still wore the straw hat. Dragon had a map open on the desk. He turned it to face Luffy. This is the Grand Line, he said, which Luffy knew, but Dragon started explanations from the base as a habit. This is the arc of the world government's military presence. These points are where their power is most concentrated, the 3 Marine headquarters branches, the 2 main Buster Call staging areas, Marineford. He tapped each location. You understand what we're trying to change? The system, Luffy said. He'd been hearing the word for as long as he could remember, spoken the way other children heard words like home or food, something foundational. Something that structured everything else. The system, Dragon confirmed. The celestial dragons. The slave trade. The arrangement that makes the world government untouchable by law, because they are the law. He looked at Luffy. You've known about this. But I want you to understand it now differently. Not as background. As the thing you're training to address. Luffy looked at the map. He was quiet for a moment. You're telling me this differently because of the cave. Dragon said nothing, which was as good as yes. You think I can actually do something about it? I think, Dragon said carefully, that you are going to be the most powerful person alive within the next decade. And I think that power without understanding is just force. Force without direction destroys the wrong things. Luffy looked at him. So you want to make sure I destroy the right things? I want you to decide for yourself what the right things are. Dragon said. That's the difference between what I'm trying to do and what the world government does. Luffy was quiet again. Then he said, I want to be free. I know. And I want everyone to be free. Not because of the revolution. He looked at his father directly. Because people should be. That's obvious. Dragon looked at his son for a long moment. The light in the office caught the lines of Luffy's face, still a child's face, but with something behind it now that hadn't been there before, something that had depth. Yes, Dragon said. That's the right reason. Luffy nodded. He looked at the map again, tracing the Grand Line with one finger. When do we start real missions? You're 8. Almost 9. When you're ready. Dragon said. I'm ready now. You're not. Dragon said without heat. You're close. There's a difference. Luffy looked up at him. For a moment Dragon thought he was going to argue, the way he argued everything, immediately, directly, with the genuine bafflement of someone who didn't understand why his own assessment of himself wasn't the final word. Instead, Luffy said, Okay. Tell me what ready looks like. Dragon felt that thing again, the small sharp feeling he'd never found a better name for. He turned the map back around and began to explain. Outside, Sabo was running the cliff path on his own, pushing past the point where his lungs told him to stop, moving the line of when tired becomes unable with the methodical patience of someone who had decided he was going to be worthy of the life he'd fallen into. Below the cliff, in the cave, the light breathed. In the crystal, something that had been sleeping for longer than the world government had existed turned in its sleep and dreamed of open sky. Luffy walked home for dinner with his straw hat on and something in his chest that was warm in the way of after cold water, after sun, the particular warmth of coming into your actual size. He was 8 years old, and he had no ceiling that anyone had been able to describe. He ate 3 helpings of soup, argued with Sabo about whether he'd finished his conditioning work or cut it short, and fell asleep the moment his head hit the pillow. In the morning, before dawn, he woke and sat up and looked at the ceiling with the listening expression, and in the cave below the cliff the light answered him back, and it was not a pulse anymore but something stronger and steadier and entirely awake. Chapter 3. The First War. The slave port at Tequila Wolf smelled like salt and rot and the specific human despair that accumulated in places where people were kept in cages long enough that hope stopped visiting. Luffy smelled it from half a mile out, standing at the prow of the Revolutionary Army's fastest cutter, the wind hitting his face and the pre-dawn dark still thick enough that the port was just a smear of torchlight against the horizon. He didn't say anything about the smell. He just stood there with both hands on the rail and let it settle into him, let it become something that sharpened rather than sickened. Dragon stood beside him. He was reading a report in the dark, because Dragon could do that, read by minimal light, process information while monitoring for other things. He said without looking up, "What do you feel?" 43 Marines on the outer perimeter, Luffy said. 7 on the dock. 2 ships in harbor. One's bigger armed. The other's a transport. He paused. There's a lot of people inside the main facility. Packed close. Some of them aren't moving. Dragon folded the report. Sleeping? Some of them. Luffy's jaw set. Not all. Behind them, the deck was quiet in the controlled way of people who were professionally quiet. 40 of the army's best. Bello Betty in her red dress with the flag folded under her arm, Morley sitting against the mast like a boulder that had learned to breathe, Lindbergh checking his equipment in fast efficient movements, Koala reviewing the floor plans of the facility with a lamp she'd shielded to show nothing from the shore. She was 15 and she moved through mission prep like she'd been doing it since birth, which she nearly had. Sabo was at Luffy's left. He'd turned 13 2 weeks ago and Dragon had spent those 2 weeks doing final assessments that both boys knew were final assessments, which meant the whole thing had a particular weight that nobody talked about directly. Sabo's hockey had solidified, not as expansive as Luffy's, but clean and deep, and his combat theory was the best Dragon had seen in someone his age. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the torchlight on the horizon, and he said, "The southern approach is cleaner. The rocks give us cover until we're 40 feet from the outer wall." "Already planned," Luffy said. "I know. I'm confirming we're agreed." Luffy looked at him. "We're agreed." This was how they worked in the field, Luffy reading the space with his observation, Sabo organizing what Luffy sensed into structured action, both of them moving through the process fast enough that the exchange was more like a single person thinking than 2 people consulting. Dragon had watched it develop over the past year and had not said anything about it because it didn't need commentary. It was good. It was, in fact, exceptional. He had trained them toward it deliberately, and they had exceeded what he'd trained them toward, which was the ideal outcome and also faintly unnerving. Dragon turned to the deck. Final positions. The team moved. Luffy had been on 3 operations before this. 2 extractions, a dissident historian on O'Hara's remnant community and a former world government cipher clerk who'd reached out to the Army's network with intelligence on marine cipher protocols, and 1 supply raid on a government weapons depot in the North Blue. All 3 had been support roles, Dragon's way of letting him learn the texture of real operations before giving him real responsibility. Tonight was different. Dragon had said so explicitly, in the briefing 3 days ago, and Luffy had listened to every word with the focused attention he reserved for things that mattered. "This operation has 3 objectives," Dragon had said. 1. Free the prisoners. 2. Destroy the facility's infrastructure. 3. Extract the prisoner manifest, which contains the names of every Celestial Dragon client on the southern procurement route. He'd looked at both boys. "You're not support tonight. You are 2 of the 40. You operate with the same authority and the same responsibility as anyone else on that deck." Sabo had asked what the rules of engagement were. Dragon had said, "Protect the prisoners, neutralize resistance. Do not kill unless no other option exists and time has run out." Luffy had asked how many Marines were in the facility. Dragon had said, approximately 200, plus a vice admiral. Luffy had nodded like that was useful data. Sabo had been quiet for 3 seconds, then said, "Which vice admiral?" "Enigmo," Dragon had said. The name meant something. Enigmo was not one of the political appointments, the men who bought their rank or inherited it through family connection. He was a fighter, Spider-Man they called him in intelligence reports, six-sword style, hockey user, personally responsible for the capture and return of 17 escaped slaves in the past 4 years. He believed in the system he worked for with the conviction of someone who had decided long ago that the alternative to the system was chaos, and who had seen enough chaos to find that argument compelling. Dragon had not told them to avoid him. He hadn't needed to. The southern approach was 40 feet of open ground and Luffy crossed it in a second and a half, Sabo 2 steps behind him, the main team spreading into their designated positions with the efficiency of a long-practiced machine. The Marine on the wall saw nothing until Luffy's coated fist hit the stone base of the guard tower, and the structure listed, and the guard tumbled off the back side into Koala's waiting hands, unconscious before he fully understood that contact had been made. No alarm. Luffy went over the wall and dropped into the facility yard. The port facility was large, 3 main buildings surrounding a central holding area, the holding area itself divided into cells by iron fencing, the whole compound lit by evenly spaced oil lamps that created predictable pools of light and predictable shadows between them. Luffy's observation had already mapped it. He moved through the shadows not because he was hiding, he was past needing to hide, but because reaching the holding area fast was the actual objective and the shadows were the fastest route. He was halfway across the yard when the Marines noticed something was wrong. Not him specifically. A commotion on the western wall where Morley was coming through. Morley did not do subtle entry, and the alert shout that went up was immediate and loud, and the yard went from quiet to active in under 4 seconds. Luffy stopped pretending to be subtle. He stretched both arms back, coiled them across his chest in an X, and released. The technique had no name yet, he'd been working on it for 6 months, the idea of using his body's elasticity not as individual strikes but as full body compression and release, storing kinetic energy across his entire torso, and releasing it as a forward impact that hit like a cannon. He'd been refining it in the training yard, calibrating the force to the target, learning the muscle memory of it. He hit the iron gate of the holding area going fast enough that the gate went inward like paper. Marines shouted. Luffy was already through. The prisoners were in worse shape than the observation had suggested, because observation didn't tell you about faces. He stopped for exactly 1 second in the entrance to the main holding structure and looked at the people in the cells, 50, 60, some of them chained to the walls, some just sitting on the stone floor with the particular stillness of people who had stopped expecting rescue. They were all ages. Children, old men, a woman who couldn't have been more than 20 holding a younger child against her chest. The 1 second passed. Luffy went to the nearest chain, coated his hand in armament, and snapped it. "Move toward the south gate," he said, and his voice was not loud but it carried, and something in it, something that had been growing in him since the cave, since the throne, since the warm gold weight of something ancient making itself at home in his chest, made people respond immediately. Not fear. Something more like the feeling of hearing a clear note cut through noise. "South gate now. There are people there to help you." The chains went faster than he expected. The armament was denser these days, more natural, and he moved through the cells in systematic order, breaking what needed breaking, keeping his voice level and his movements deliberate. People who had been sitting in stunned stillness were on their feet. The woman with the child was moving. An old man with shackle wounds on his wrists was walking with more steadiness than his condition suggested, because someone had come, and people in bad situations often found out they had more strength left than they knew when someone came. Sabo appeared at the cell block's far entrance. He took one look at the processing Luffy had already done, did the math, and moved to the eastern section without being asked. "There's a secure room in the northeast corner," Sabo said as he worked, not raising his voice. "That's where the manifest will be." I know, Luffy said. I can feel it. There are 3 people in there, 2 of them are scared. One of them isn't. The Vice Admiral. Probably. Sabo was quiet for a moment, snapping a chain with a precise hockey-coated strike. Dragons heading to that room from the outside. I know that too. Luffy finished the last cell in his section and turned. All the prisoners in the main structure were mobile. Go with the evacuation. I'll take the northeast corner. Sabo looked at him. Not doubtfully. He'd stopped doubting Luffy in the field 6 months ago, when he'd watched Luffy read a shifting close-quarters situation faster than anyone else present, and make 3 consecutive correct decisions in under 10 seconds. He looked at Luffy with the expression of someone filing information for later. Dragon said, we have the same authority as everyone else. Luffy said. This is me using mine. Sabo held the look for 1 more second. Then he turned and moved with the prisoners toward the south gate, organizing the evacuation with the systematic efficiency that was his natural mode. Luffy went northeast. The compound had gone loud by now. He could hear it all: Bello Betty's flag going up somewhere in the western section, the surge of coordinated fighting spirit that her ability produced like a tide, the Marines' response organizing into 2 centers of resistance, the sounds of Morley reshaping the terrain with his devil fruit in ways that made further defense difficult. The army was performing exactly as trained. Dragon had planned this well. The Marines were fighting back, but they were fighting a dismantled situation, their perimeter broken, their positions separated, their chain of command disrupted in the first 60 seconds. What Dragon had not fully planned for was Luffy going to the northeast corner alone. Dragon would be annoyed about that later. Luffy had already made peace with the annoyance. The door to the secure room was reinforced, iron-plated, 2-inch bolts, the kind of door designed to make access difficult long enough for whatever was inside to be destroyed. Luffy looked at it for half a second and then hit it with a fully coated shoulder at full compression, and the door came off its frame and traveled 8 feet into the room beyond. The 2 men inside were clerks, civilian contractors. They dove for cover. One of them was scrambling toward a fireplace where papers were already beginning to catch, the standard protocol for manifest destruction under raid conditions. Luffy stretched one arm, plucked the papers out of the fire in one motion, and set them on the desk. They had scorched edges. The critical data was intact. The third person in the room was standing at the far wall. Vice Admiral Enigma was a large man, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the particular stillness of someone who was not frightened and was not pretending not to be frightened. He had 6 swords, 2 at his hips, for held in his other limbs in a configuration that shouldn't have been physically possible, which was because it wasn't physically possible in the normal sense, and the Vice Admiral was clearly not operating in the normal sense. All 6 blades were drawn. All of them were coated in armament so dense it looked like black glass. He looked at Luffy. Luffy looked at him. "You're a child," Enigma said. Not dismissively. Factually. The way Dragon stated facts. "I'm 13," Luffy said. "Dragon's boy," Enigma said. "We've had reports. Nothing that made me take it seriously." "That's going to be a problem for your reports," Luffy said. Enigma moved. He was fast. Genuinely fast, the kind of speed that came from decades of serious training and a body built for combat, and all 6 swords came at different angles simultaneously in a pattern designed to eliminate the gaps that a single opponent using multiple weapons naturally created. Against a normal opponent it was overwhelming. The multiple attack vectors created a closing cage of armament-coated steel that covered every direction of escape and every point of defensive response. Luffy stretched. Not a dodge, a fundamental change in geometry. He compressed his torso to almost nothing, the swords passing through the space where a solid human body had been a moment ago, and as they passed through he grabbed 2 of Enigma's sword arms with his own extended arms, twisted, and used the Vice Admiral's own momentum to redirect 3 of the swords into the floor. 3 down. Enigma wrenched back, adapting instantly, not panicking, not thrown, just recalibrating. That was what made him genuinely dangerous. He didn't stop thinking. Interesting, Enigmo said, and meant it. He came again with the remaining 3 swords, this time slower, more controlled, probing rather than overwhelming, reading Luffy's responses, cataloging the technique. Luffy was doing the same thing. The observation was giving him everything, Enigmo's intention before his body expressed it, the direction and weight of each strike a fraction of a second before it arrived. The armament was solid enough now that the swords that connected didn't cut. And the thing in his chest, the throne's warmth, the particular depth of will that had been building since that day in the cave, was right there behind his haki, not intervening, just present. Like something watching with interest. He let Enigmo take 3 more exchanges, reading him, and then he stopped defending. He stepped into the next strike. The sword hit his shoulder and didn't penetrate, and Luffy's coated fist hit Enigmo in the sternum with everything, compression, release, the full body stored force he'd been building since the gate. The impact was not a punch in the conventional sense. It was closer to being hit by something that had been falling for a very long time. Enigmo went through the wall. Not the door. The wall. Luffy stepped through the hole. The Vice Admiral was on his back in the corridor outside, 3 of his swords scattered, the armament still on his skin but his body processing a hit that even armament couldn't make nothing. He was conscious. His eyes were open and they were looking at Luffy with an expression that was genuinely difficult to read, not just pain, not just shock. Something more complicated. Something that looked like the beginning of a reconsideration. "The prisoners are leaving," Luffy said, looking down at him. "You can get up and keep fighting or you can let them go. I'll beat you either way, but one of those options leaves you in better condition than the other." Enigmo looked at the ceiling for a moment. He was doing math, Dragon's son could see it, real calculation, not pride management. The sounds from the compound had changed. The Marines were losing the perimeter. The army's evacuation was far enough along that interdiction was no longer viable. The math was what it was. "This isn't over," Enigmo said. "I know," Luffy said. "But tonight it is." The Vice Admiral stayed down. Luffy went back for the manifest. Dragon found him coming out of the northeast corner with a scorched sheaf of papers under one arm. He looked at the hole in the wall. He looked at Luffy. He looked at the hole again. "Enigmo," Luffy said. "I see that," Dragon said. "He's okay. Mostly." Dragon took the manifest from him and glanced at it, just long enough to confirm its integrity, and then looked at his son with an expression that was doing a great deal of internal work. "I planned to take that room myself." "I was closer," Luffy said. "You went alone against a Vice Admiral." "And I got the manifest," Luffy said, not defensively. Just pointing at the outcome. "Also he's okay, so the rules of engagement are intact." Dragon was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the facility burned in the sections Lindbergh had targeted, the structural damage deliberate and precise, taking the infrastructure without touching the holding areas where prisoners might still be moving. The army's extraction was in its final stages. The Marine resistance had collapsed. "We'll discuss this on the ship," Dragon said. "Okay," Luffy said easily. They walked toward the south gate. Dragon said nothing else, but at one point his hand came down briefly on Luffy's shoulder. Not a reprimand, not direction. Just a hand on a shoulder, quick and gone. Luffy looked up at him. Dragon was already looking forward. Luffy smiled and kept walking. The debrief on the ship was thorough, which was Dragon's style regardless of outcome. Every team member reported their section, the points of deviation from the plan, the decisions made under time pressure, and the reasoning behind them. Dragon listened to all of it without expression and asked clean, precise questions that made people think harder about what they'd actually done rather than what they wished they'd done. When it was Luffy's turn, he gave it straight: the cell block, the evacuation process, the northeast room, Enigmo. He reported the fight with the same detachment he'd give a training assessment, noting what had worked, what Enigmo had done that he hadn't anticipated, the moment he'd adjusted the tactical approach from defensive to offensive, and why. Dragon asked 3 questions. 2 of them were about the fight itself. Luffy answered both completely. The third was, "Why did you go to that room instead of staying with the evacuation?" "Because Sabo was better for the evacuation than I was," Luffy said. "He's organized. People listen to him when there's chaos. I would have helped, but he would have done it better." He looked at Dragon. "And because I could feel that the manifest was about to burn and you were still on the west side." "You had 30 seconds, Dragon said. "I know. That's why I didn't wait." Dragon looked at him for a long moment. Then he moved on to the next team member. After the debrief, Koala spread the manifest on the main table and began cataloging, her handwriting small and quick, cross-referencing names against the Army's existing intelligence database. The room went serious around her work. Everyone understood what the manifest represented, not just the operational value but the weight of it, the names of celestial dragons who had placed orders for human beings and had been doing so for years under the assumption of permanent impunity. Sabo sat next to Luffy on one side of the cabin. They were both tired in the specific way of people who'd used everything they had, not exhausted, but empty in the way that would fill back up with sleep. Sabo had a cut on his forearm he was wrapping himself with practiced efficiency. Luffy was eating, because Luffy was always eating, working through someone's donated portion with the focused dedication he brought to all important tasks. "The wall trick," Sabo said quietly. "The compression release. What do you call it?" Luffy thought about it, chewing. "Gear second, maybe? Because it's like a next gear. You need a whole system name? I have more coming." Sabo looked at him. "You've been working on more." "Yeah." Luffy looked at his hands. "There are ideas. From the throne thing, it's like having extra vocabulary. I can see combinations I couldn't see before." Sabo was quiet for a moment. "Show me when we get back." "Obviously." Outside, the sea slid past them under a sky that was going from black to navy, the horizon beginning to define itself in a thin line of not quite light. The burning facility was somewhere behind them, an orange smudge getting smaller. Ahead was Moonscar and rest and the resumption of the normal texture of their lives. Luffy leaned his head back against the cabin wall and looked at the ceiling. He thought about the woman with the child, the way she'd moved toward the south gate. He thought about the old man's steadiness. He thought about Enigmo lying on the corridor floor making real calculations, not pretending, just thinking, and the complicated feeling that had produced, which wasn't pity and wasn't respect exactly, but something in the space between them. The feeling of looking at someone on the wrong side of something and understanding that they weren't stupid or evil, just wrong in a way that cost other people. He thought about Dragon's hand on his shoulder. "Hey Sabo," he said. The system is really big." "Yes," Sabo said. "But it's not unbeatable." Sabo looked at him. "No," he said. "It's not." Luffy closed his eyes. "Good." He was asleep in under a minute, which was another thing that made Sabo shake his head with quiet, genuine fondness, the ability to be completely in the moment, completely out of it, nothing in between. He watched his brother sleep and thought about what had happened in the northeast corner, about the vice admiral who'd stayed down. About what that meant, what it suggested about where Luffy was and where he was going. He thought about the manifest on the table and the names Koala was writing down. He thought about the children in the cells. He thought about what it actually meant to try to change the world, not as an abstract principle, the way he'd been thinking about it since he found his way to the revolution, but as a concrete thing. A room. A chain. A face. Dragon came out of the debrief area and stood at the porthole, looking at the water. He didn't look at his sleeping son. But he stood near him, the way people stood near things they were keeping track of without wanting to appear to be keeping track of. Koala looked up from the manifest. 48 confirmed clients, she said quietly. 7 of them are sitting members of the Reverie Council. Dragon's expression didn't change. But something in the room changed with the information, a weight settling, a gravity becoming clearer. 48 names. 7 council members. A thread of the web pulled. Good, Dragon said. The same word as Luffy, a completely different weight. The ship moved through the pre-dawn sea. Luffy slept with his straw hat on his chest. Sabo watched the horizon. In the east, the sun was coming up. 3 days after they returned to Moonscar, the news came through the Army's intelligence network. A Marine report, official, circulated internally, which meant someone inside was sending it out, which meant the Army's penetration of Marine communications was working. Dragon read it in his office, and then read it again. He brought it to Luffy that evening. It was a threat assessment. The kind the Marines produced after significant incidents, catalog of evidence, analysis of capability, recommended response classification. Luffy stood at Dragon's desk and read it, which he did quickly and completely. Another thing that had changed since the cave: he'd always been smart, but his reading had been slow and patient. Now he moved through text the way he moved through space, efficiently and with clear destination. The report described the Tequila Wolf raid, the destruction of the facility, the liberation of 63 prisoners, the recovery of the manifest by revolutionary forces. It described the engagement with Vice Admiral Enigmo and Enigmo's account of that engagement, which was precise and not flattering to Enigmo personally but was very specific about the nature of his opponent. It described the opponent as unknown individual, approximately 12 to 15 years of age, male, combat capability assessed at Vice Admiral level or above. Rubber-based devil fruit confirmed. Additional combat characteristics inconsistent with known paramecia parameters. Hockey development anomalous for assessed age range. Possible undocumented ability type. Threat classification, urgent. Recommend immediate intelligence priority. At the bottom of the report, handwritten in the notation space, Dragon's asset? Son? Luffy looked up from the report. Dragon was watching him. They know about me, Luffy said. They know something exists, Dragon said. They don't know what. Yet. Yet, Dragon agreed. Luffy put the report down. He thought about it for a moment, not with anxiety, Dragon noted, not with the shrinking that most people did when they learned they'd been noticed by the world government. He thought about it with the expression of someone adjusting for new information, recalibrating. So we don't have as much time as you thought, Luffy said. No. How much time do we have? Dragon looked at his son. Enough, he said. If we use it well. Luffy nodded. Then we use it well. He picked his straw hat up from the desk where he'd set it, slapped it on, and looked at Dragon with that direct, enormous gaze. What's next? He said. Dragon almost smiled. Sit down, he said. I have to explain something about a man named Doflamingo. Luffy sat. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, hat brim shadowing his eyes, and he listened. Outside, Moonscar moved through a clear afternoon, the crosswind gentle, the sea bright. Somewhere below the western cliff, the light in the cave breathed in its long patient rhythm, deep and steady, the heartbeat of something that had been waiting a very long time and was not waiting anymore. The world was large and full of chains. The boy who was going to break them was 13 years old and learning the name of his next problem. He looked like he was looking forward to it. Chapter 4: Brothers and Enemies. Dragon sent Luffy alone on a Tuesday. No briefing document, no extraction team on standby, no Sabo. Just a morning where Dragon came to the training yard, watched Luffy finish his run, and said, "Pack for 2 weeks. You leave at noon." Luffy stopped walking. "Where am I going?" "Dressrosa," Dragon said. "There's a contact there, a woman named Viola, works inside the Don Quixote household as an intelligence asset. She's been compromised. The network thinks she has maybe 5 days before Doflamingo's people close the loop on her." He paused. "Extract her." Luffy considered this for about 3 seconds. "By myself." "By yourself? What about Sabo?" Dragon looked at him evenly. "What about Sabo?" Luffy understood. He nodded once, went to pack. Sabo found out at 11:30, which gave him 30 minutes to argue about it, which was enough time for Dragon to listen to the argument, find it reasonable, and decline it anyway. Sabo had good instincts about operational risk and his concern was genuine and structured. He'd listed 4 specific threat vectors that a solo operation presented that a 2-person operation would reduce. Dragon acknowledged all 4 points. Then why is he going alone? Sabo asked. Because he needs to know he can, Dragon said. Sabo looked at him. Then looked at the dock where Luffy was loading a small supply pack onto the cutter, wearing his straw hat, looking like someone going on a day trip. Sabo pressed his lips together. If something happens to him, something will happen to him, Dragon said. Several things, probably. That's not the same as something going wrong. Sabo's jaw was tight. That's a difficult distinction. Most useful distinctions are, Dragon said, and went back inside. Sabo walked to the dock. Luffy was tying off the supply pack, testing the knots with a quick professional tug. He looked up when Sabo arrived. Don't, Luffy said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say something about being careful. Sabo opened his mouth. Closed it. I was going to say watch Doflamingo's top officers. His family, the Don Quixote pirates, operate like a feudal structure. There are layers between Doflamingo and direct action, and the dangerous ones aren't the ones you'll see first. Luffy looked at him for a moment. Then he grinned. That's actually useful. I know. Sabo leaned against the dock post. He looked at the cutter, at the horizon beyond it, at Luffy's face. 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Luffy confirmed. He grabbed the line, stepped aboard. I'll bring you something from Dressrosa. I don't need a souvenir. I'll bring you something anyway. He pushed off from the dock. The current caught the cutter, and it began to move. Luffy stood in the stern and looked back once, at Sabo on the dock, at the island behind him, at the western cliff where the cave entrance was visible as a dark seam in the rock face. He looked at it all with the expression of someone taking a photograph they'll look at later. Then he faced forward. Sabo watched until the cutter was a white triangle on the blue water, then a point, then nothing. He went to find Dragon and asked if he could double his training hours for the next 2 weeks. Dragon said yes without looking up from his work. Dressrosa was a loud island. That was Luffy's first impression coming into port, not the flowers, not the architecture, not the striking women in bright dresses or the toy soldiers on every corner that the intelligence briefing had mentioned. Just the noise of it. Music from 4 directions simultaneously, vendors competing with each other and with the music, a crowd that moved at the particular compressed density of a city that had too many people and not enough space and had decided to celebrate this rather than address it. He tied off at a public dock, paid the fee with coin Koala had pressed on him before he left, and walked into the city with his hands in his pockets and his hat pulled low. The cover was simple, a traveling merchant's apprentice from the East Blue, which was boring enough to be true and common enough not to attract attention. He had papers, real ones, the Army's forgery network was exceptional, and a route through the city's textile district that would put him adjacent to the contact point. He had the contact details memorized. Viola, second dancer in the Corrida Coliseum's pre-fight entertainment rotation. She didn't know the Army was sending someone, only that if she saw a certain mark in a certain location she should follow the person who left it. Koala's design. Luffy had thought it was overcomplicated, but Koala had given him a look that communicated several things about his understanding of intelligence tradecraft, so he'd committed it to memory and moved on. He found the textile district, found the corner, left the mark, and then went to find food while he waited. Dressrosa fed him well. He had skewered meat from a street vendor, something fried and unidentifiable but excellent from a cart near the fountain, and was working through a paper cone of something sweet when his observation picked up the tale. 2 people, 40 feet back. Moving with the crowd but not moving like the crowd, the particular stillness within motion that meant tracking. Not panicked, not aggressive. Professional. Luffy finished his food, turned into a side street, and waited. They came around the corner and found him standing there looking at them. Both were dressed civilian but carried themselves wrong for it, the posture of trained fighters in clothes that didn't fit the training. One was large and flat-faced, the other narrow with quick eyes. They stopped when they saw him. You left the mark? The narrow one said. That was not the response protocol. Luffy looked at them. Wrong answer, he said. The large one moved first, which was what large ones usually did, and Luffy sidestepped it with the easy patience of someone for whom full-size adults moving fast was a completely manageable variable. He let the man's momentum carry him into the alley wall, caught him by the collar on the way, deposited him sitting on the ground. He looked at the narrow one. Try again, Luffy said pleasantly. The narrow one had a hand at his weapon, then didn't, then looked at his partner slumped against the wall and made a calculation. Don Quixote intelligence, he said. We've been monitoring the mark point. We pick up anyone who leaves it. So Viola had already been burned. Which meant the 5-day window had closed faster than projected, and right now Viola was either being watched or had already been moved. Luffy thought about this quickly and without the anxiety that bad news usually produced in people receiving it. He just updated the picture. Where is she? Luffy said. Who? The woman you've been waiting for me to lead you to. The narrow man's eyes shifted fractionally. Not to his partner. Somewhere else. Luffy's observation caught the direction of the look before the man corrected it. Thank you, Luffy said. He stretched his arm 4 streets over, grabbed a flagpole, and was gone before either man fully processed that he'd moved. The Don Quixote household safe house for persons of interest was in the Flower District, which was either a lack of imagination or a deliberate irony. Luffy couldn't tell. It was a 3-story building with fresh paint and iron shutters and 4 guards on the ground floor who thought the shutters made them hard to observe from above. Luffy observed from above. 3 floors. Viola on the 2nd floor, east room. He could feel her, the observation picking up the controlled stillness of someone trying very hard not to demonstrate fear. 2 guards in the room. 4 downstairs. 1 on the roof who was sitting down, and had been sitting down long enough to have become less attentive than he'd started. The roof guard was first. Luffy came down from the adjacent building fast and low, the armament on his hands, the hit precise enough to drop the man into unconsciousness without the noise of a fall. He caught him, set him down, kept moving. The room door was locked. Luffy knocked. A pause. Then, who is it? Luffy glanced at the guards inside through the door with his observation. Both moving toward a defensive position. He said, Someone dragon sent. And the character of the tension inside the room changed immediately. One of the guards' positions shifted in a way that wasn't defensive but uncertain, which told Luffy there was a guard in there who knew the revolution's name and was re-evaluating. He opened the door anyway because waiting for re-evaluation was slow. The 2 guards reacted, one of them swinging immediately. Luffy ducked under it and hit him in the solar plexus with an armament-coated palm, straightforward and economical. The 2nd guard, the uncertain one, had not fully committed to attacking by the time his partner was on the floor, and Luffy looked at him and said, You don't want to do this. The guard looked at his partner. Looked at Luffy. Made the same calculation the narrow man in the alley had made. He stepped aside. Viola was in the corner of the room standing very still. She was a striking woman in her late 20s, dark-haired, with the posture of someone trained in dance, and the eyes of someone trained in something else. She was looking at Luffy with an expression that was trying to reconcile what she saw, a 14-year-old boy in a straw hat, with the situation as she understood it. Dragon sent you, she said. Not a question. Checking. Dragon sent me, Luffy confirmed. We need to move. The mark was compromised. How much time do we have before someone comes to check on this room? She absorbed the urgency without drama. 1 hour. The rotation. Okay. Do you have anything you need to take? Nothing that isn't in my head. Good. Let's go. He led her out the way he'd come in, across the roof, down the side of the adjacent building. She was nimble, dancer's balance, real physical capability. She kept pace without being told to and didn't ask questions while they were moving. Luffy noted these things with the same automatic cataloging he did with everyone, adding them to his picture of who she was and what she could do. They were 2 streets from the port when Doflamingo's officers found them. There were 4 of them, and Luffy recognized 2 from the intelligence briefings Dragon had given him in the weeks before this mission. The first was Diamante, the hero of the Colosseum, sharp, theatrical, a blade user with a paramecia that made things flutter like cloth. The second was Treble, which was a problem. Treble's belly fruit made him a sticky substance user with an area control that was difficult in enclosed spaces. The other 2 were unknown. Officers, not grunts, they carried themselves with the authority of people who were accustomed to being the end of the conversation. Diamante looked at Luffy the way adults always looked at him initially, the assessment that calculated age first and discounted accordingly. He was going to say something about this. Luffy could see it forming. Treble, keep the woman, Diamante said instead, apparently deciding to skip the commentary. The boy isn't in the intel. Find out who he is. Treble oozed sideways. That was the only word for it, toward Viola, and Luffy stepped into the gap between them, which rearranged the geometry of the situation in a way that required Treble to go through him to reach Viola. That's going to be difficult, Luffy said. Diamante's sword came out. The blade went cloth flat and wide, sweeping horizontal in an arc that covered 10 feet in a half-second and would have cut someone who stood still, which Luffy did not. He went under it, closed the distance to Diamante in 2 steps, and hit him once, full armament, right hand, center of gravity. Diamante went backward into the wall of the nearest building and through it, into someone's flower shop, scattering vases and filling the air with the smell of cut petals. The 2 unknown officers came together. Luffy assessed them in real time. One was a swordsman with armament, one was a brawler who had haki but hadn't fully developed it. Both were fast. He was faster. The swordsman's technique was clean and he was genuinely skilled, and the exchange lasted 6 real seconds, which was long by Luffy's current metrics. The man's blade kept finding angles that required actual defensive response rather than simple evasion. Luffy let him work for 4 seconds, reading the pattern, and on the 5th found the flaw in the upper left transition and put him down with a compressed body strike that used the full gear technique, the same thing he'd used on Enigmo but refined now, better calibrated, less raw. The brawler threw everything at once, which was the right call given what he just watched happen to his partner, overwhelmed before pattern recognition, go wide before going precise. Luffy admired the instinct while moving through the offensive like it was weather, and the return strike was clinical. Treble had not moved toward Viola during the fighting. That was interesting, and Luffy filed it as he turned. Treble was standing 8 feet from him, and the sticky substance was everywhere, on the walls, on the street, in a radius that made the ground uncertain. He was watching Luffy with small sharp eyes above the mass of his face, and he was not afraid, which meant he had either miscalculated or had something to rely on. Doflamingo's going to want to know about you, Treble said. His voice was high and wet. He's going to find out eventually, Luffy said. But tonight's not the night. He stretched one arm back and used it as a slingshot, his body as the projectile, going up and over the radius of the sticky ground entirely. He came down outside it, grabbed Viola's wrist, and they ran. Behind them, Treble didn't pursue. That was the more interesting data point. He let them go, which meant he'd gotten what he wanted, which was information. Luffy filed that as they ran, adding it to his picture of how Doflamingo's operation functioned. They reached the dock. The cutter was there. Luffy cast off without slowing down and Viola helped without being asked, because she clearly had some sailing experience, and didn't need to be managed. They cleared the harbor in 4 minutes, and the wind caught the sail, and the island began to recede. Viola sat in the bow and looked at him. After a while she said, "How old are you?" 14, Luffy said. She looked at the island behind them. "I worked inside that household for 3 years," she said. 3 years of pretending, of watching what he does to people, of sending information out and hoping it meant something." She looked back at Luffy. "And Dragon sent a 14-year-old to pull me out. Does that bother you?" Luffy asked. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. It doesn't. She looked at her hands. It just tells me something about you. Luffy looked at the horizon. What's Doflamingo actually like? Up close. Viola's expression changed, not fear, something more specific. He's charming, she said. That's the thing people don't understand about him. He's genuinely charming, and he believes completely in what he does. He doesn't think he's the villain. He thinks the world is a garbage pile, and he's simply honest about it in a way that weaker people aren't. She paused. That's what makes him dangerous. He's not performing. He just has a completely different understanding of what people are worth. Luffy thought about this. He thought about the compound at Tequila Wolf, about Enigmo on the floor doing honest calculations, about the difference between people who were wrong in ways that were reachable and people who were wrong in ways that had become foundational to everything they were. He's going to be a problem, Luffy said. Yes, Viola said. I'll come back for him, Luffy said. The certainty of it, not a promise, not a declaration, just a plain statement of future fact, made Viola look at him with an expression that was hard to name. Like someone who had been holding their breath for 3 years and had just heard the sound of something that might be the end of needing to. She looked forward at the sea. Luffy sailed them home. He was back on Moonscar 11 days into the 2 weeks, which was faster than expected. Sabo was in the training yard when the cutter came in, running forms with the methodical focus he brought to solo training, slightly different from his partnered work, more internal, like he was having a conversation with himself. He stopped when he saw Luffy walking up from the dock. 11 days, Sabo said. Things moved fast. Luffy reached into the supply pack and pulled out something wrapped in paper. He held it out. Sabo looked at it. I told you I didn't need a souvenir. I know. Luffy shook the package slightly. It's a flower. From the flower shop. It was already cut when everything happened and I thought, look, just take the flower, Sabo. Sabo took the flower. He looked at it, a dark red thing, still holding its shape despite the journey. He didn't say anything for a moment. Did you get her out? He said. Yeah. Were there problems? Some. 4 of Doflamingo's officers. Sabo looked up from the flower. 4. At once? 2 at once, then treble then. Luffy waved it off. I'll give you the full breakdown later. There's something important about how Treble responded that I want Dragon to hear. They walked together toward the main building. The island was in its late afternoon configuration, training yards winding down, the smell of dinner starting from the mess hall, the particular transitional quality of the day's light going amber. Luffy breathed it in. He'd been away 11 days and the island felt exactly the same, which was both reassuring and made him aware that the world outside it was not the same at all. It moved and shifted and had Doflamingo's officers watching mark points and celestial dragons placing orders and vice admirals updating threat assessments. Moonscar was a fixed point. The world was not. Hey, he said. Sabo said. Doflamingo is worse than the briefing made him sound. Sabo looked at him. How so? The briefing described what he does. It didn't describe what he is. Luffy thought about Viola's words, genuinely charming, completely different understanding of what people are worth. He's not doing what he does because he has to or because he's afraid. He does it because he actually thinks that's what the world is. Sabo walked beside him in silence for a moment. That's harder to fight than ambition, he said eventually. Yeah. You can give an ambitious person a better option, Sabo said. You can't give a worldview a better option. You can show it something it hasn't seen yet, Luffy said. Sabo looked at him. What does that mean? Luffy thought about it. About what it would look like, not a debate, not an argument, not even a fight in the conventional sense. Something more like a demonstration. Like standing in front of a belief and being so entirely and completely the opposite of it that the belief runs out of room. I don't know exactly, he said. But I'll figure it out when I get there. Sabo looked at the flower in his hand. He shook his head slowly. You are extremely difficult to worry about, he said. I want you to know that I do worry, but you make it very hard to justify it. Luffy started laughing. Dragon's reaction to the debrief was characteristically contained, which meant it contained a great deal. He listened to everything: the timeline deviation, the burn mark point, the 4 officers, Treble's deliberate non-pursuit, without interrupting, and when Luffy finished, Dragon was quiet for a while in the way that meant he was restructuring something. Treble let you go, Dragon said. Treble wanted me to know he'd seen me, Luffy said. He wasn't afraid. He was cataloging. Which means Doflamingo will receive a report about you. Yes. And Doflamingo will. Dragon stopped. He looked at his son. He'll be interested, he said, which was the careful version of what he meant, which Luffy understood to be, Doflamingo will want to test you, recruit you, or remove you, possibly in that order. You handled the extraction correctly. The Treble decision to not pursue concerns me more than the officers. Me too, Luffy said. He didn't move because he'd already gotten what he came for. It means they've known the mark point was compromised longer than we thought, long enough to set a trap for whoever came to use it, and observe them instead of engaging. He looked at Dragon. Someone in the network told them. Dragon's expression went very still in the specific way it did when he was processing something that had implications far beyond the immediate conversation. That's the conclusion I'm drawing, he said quietly. The network is compromised from inside, Luffy said. Possibly. Probably. Dragon looked at the map on his desk, the Grand Line, the red thread of the southern procurement route, the nodes of the Army's network marked in his own notation. This changes the operational posture. How long until you found it? Dragon looked up. I'm sorry? The leak. How long until you know who it is? Dragon was quiet for a moment. Then, Koala is already on it. Weeks, maybe? Okay. Luffy nodded. What do I do while you work on that? Dragon looked at his son. 14 years old, sitting across his desk with the straw hat on, and the expression of someone who has already filed the unsolvable problem in the appropriate folder and moved to the next item. Not because he didn't care. Dragon knew he cared, knew it as well as he knew anything, but because anxiety about things he couldn't immediately fix was not a mode Luffy operated in. Train, Dragon said. I've been training. Train harder. Dragon reached for a different folder on his desk. Because there's something you need to understand about the report that came in yesterday. He put it on the desk. Luffy picked it up. Marine Intelligence Assessment. Updated threat classification on the Tequila Wolf incident. More specific than the previous report, they'd clearly been working on the identification problem. The physical description was accurate. The capability assessment had moved from possible undocumented ability type to confirmed hybrid ability structure, paramecia in combination with unknown secondary classification. At the bottom, in different handwriting from the previous notation, recommend Admiral level response capability on standby for next confirmed sighting. Luffy put the report down. He looked at it for a second longer, then looked at Dragon. They're going to send an admiral. Eventually, Dragon said. Not immediately. Admiral deployment requires Senate authorization and they won't commit one for an unconfirmed target. But they're building toward it. Which one? Unknown. Kizaru is the current most likely based on deployment schedules and geographic positioning. Luffy thought about Kizaru. He'd heard Dragon discuss him. Borsalino, Pika Pika no Mi, light-speed movement, one of the 3 admirals and one of the most purely powerful fighters in the world government's arsenal. He thought about what it would mean to face that. He thought about where he was and where he needed to be. I need to work on the dragon power, he said. Dragon was very still. What do you mean? I can feel it, Luffy said. What's in the throne? I can feel it behind the haki, behind the gear techniques. It's there. I've been, not avoiding it, but not going toward it either. Just letting it sit. He looked at his hands. If an admiral's coming, I can't afford to let it sit. Dragon looked at him for a long time. He thought about the texts, about what they described, The manifestation, the process, the fact that once it began it wouldn't stop until it had fully expressed. He thought about an 8-year-old in a cave and the light going white, and a 14-year-old across his desk talking about it with the same calm he used for everything. It will change you, Dragon said. I know. Not who you are. Dragon corrected himself, because that wasn't precise. The change is physical. The expression of the power, it manifests as a form. The texts describe it as a dragon, Luffy said. Dragon stopped. I've been dreaming it for 6 years, Luffy said simply. I know what it is. Dragon looked at his son. He thought about a woman named Rouge. He thought about a tag on her wrist. He thought about all the things he'd given Luffy and all the things Luffy had simply arrived with, things that had been in him from the beginning. Yes, Dragon said quietly. A dragon. Luffy nodded. He sat with it for a moment, not with awe, but with the settling of something that had been a dream becoming a plan. Then we work toward it, he said. We work toward it, Dragon confirmed. Luffy stood up. He picked his straw hat off the desk and put it on. He looked at his father with that direct, enormous gaze that Dragon had been unable to deflect for 14 years. I'm going to train with Sabo until dinner, he said. I want to show him the treble observation. He'll have thoughts. He will, Dragon agreed. Luffy moved to the door. He had his hand on the frame when Dragon said, without looking up from the desk, You did well. Luffy stopped. Dragon didn't repeat it. He was already looking at the papers in front of him, already back in the work. His face was its standard expression, closed, focused, the face of a man who had a great deal to do and limited time to do it in. Luffy stood in the doorway for a second longer than he needed to. Thanks, he said. Quiet, just the two of them, the word doing the work of several larger things. Then he was gone, running across the courtyard toward the training yard where Sabo was, already calling his name, already starting to explain, the straw hat lifting in the crosswind and his hand coming up to catch it without breaking stride. Dragon listened to his son's voice carrying across the yard and did not look up from his papers. He turned a page. He did not do it quickly. The training that followed was different from anything that had come before. Not in structure, Dragon kept the structure deliberate and methodical, because structure was the scaffold that the other work hung from. But in quality. In depth. In what was being asked of Luffy's body and mind simultaneously. The gear techniques pushed toward their outer range, the haki pushed until it had to reach for new ground to stand on, and underneath both of those things the slow intentional work of opening a door that had been ajar for 6 years. Luffy didn't know exactly how to open it, which was honest. The texts Dragon shared with him now were more specific than what he'd read before. They described the Dragon King's form as something that didn't switch on like a devil fruit transformation but emerged, gradually, and then all at once, like a tide coming in. The precondition was will. Not anger, not fear, will. Pure and clean and directed. The will of someone who knew what they wanted and had decided the world was going to give it to them. You already have the will, Sabo said one evening, lying on his back in the training yard, staring at the sky. Both of them were post-training exhausted, the good kind, the kind that felt like progress had a physical weight. Then why hasn't it happened yet? Luffy said. Because will towards something abstract is different from will towards something specific. Sabo turned his head to look at him. You want freedom. You've always wanted freedom. But the throne power isn't going to respond to a concept. It'll respond to a moment. Luffy thought about that. He thought about what moment would be large enough, specific enough, real enough. He thought about Tequila Wolf and Dressrosa and a woman named Viola who had held her breath for 3 years. He thought about children in cells and chains that came apart when you touched them with enough intention. A moment where it's needed, Luffy said. Yeah, Sabo said. I think that's it. They looked at the sky. The stars over Moonscar were exceptional, no city light to compete with, the island's position in the Grand Line putting it in a clear atmospheric band that gave the night a particular depth. After a while Sabo said, When the Admiral comes. I know, Luffy said. You're not scared. I told you, I know what you told me. Sabo sat up. He looked at Luffy with the expression he used for things that mattered. I'm not asking if you're afraid of losing. I'm asking if you understand what it means. An admiral isn't Enigmo. It's not Doflamingo's officers. It's the full force of the world government aimed specifically at you. Luffy looked at the stars. He thought about Dragon saying the most powerful person alive within the next decade. He thought about the warm gold weight in his chest, the thing that had been growing quietly since a cave on this island, since a crystal formation and a white light, and something very old deciding he was the answer to its question. I understand, he said. And I'm still not scared. Sabo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Good. Because you need to be clear, not reckless. There's a difference. I know the difference, Luffy said. Show me, Sabo said. Luffy looked at him. What? Show me right now, tonight, the observation at full reach. Everything you can sense from here. Luffy closed his eyes. He let the observation out, all the way, no ceiling, the full range of it expanding from his body outward across the island and beyond. He could feel the island in full, every person, every animal, every shifting of air and rock and water. Beyond the island he could feel the sea, the movement of ships in the lanes, a school of something enormous moving slow and deep. And further, the limit of his range, the edge where perception became impression, where he could feel the shape of things without their details. Something at the edge. A direction. North-northwest. There's something coming, he said. From where? Far, Luffy said. Very far. But coming. He opened his eyes. He looked at Sabo. Sabo looked back at him with the expression of someone who had just confirmed something they'd been calculating. Then we'd better be ready, Sabo said. Luffy picked up his straw hat from the grass beside him. He looked at it for a moment, the worn brim, the faded red band, and put it on. Yeah, he said. He was already ready. Chapter 5. The Admiral's Answer. Kizaru arrived on a Wednesday. He came alone, which was either confidence or contempt or both, and he came on a marine vessel that moved at a speed no vessel should be able to achieve, closing the distance to Moonscar in a time that suggested someone had given him the island's coordinates with a precision that should not have been possible. The leak. Luffy thought it immediately, standing at the eastern lookout with the dawn still gray and cold, watching the ship resolve from a dark shape into a marine frigate. Koala had been working on the leak for 3 weeks without a conclusive answer. 3 weeks hadn't been enough. Dragon was already at the command post when Luffy got there, Koala beside him with a look on her face that meant she'd already done the math and didn't like the answer. Sabo came in 30 seconds after Luffy, pulling his coat on, fully alert in the way he woke up, immediately and completely, no transition. One ship, Dragon said. One admiral, Luffy said. Dragon looked at his son. He'd been looking at his son differently for the past month, or Luffy had only recently learned to read what had always been there. Something watchful and careful that was also something else, something that didn't have a clean operational name. The island needs to be evacuated, Luffy said. Already in motion, Koala said. 40 minutes for full evacuation through the southern tunnels. Then we need 40 minutes. Luffy looked at Dragon. I'll go out to meet him. Luffy, Sabo started. The island is full of people, Luffy said, turning to him. Not sharply, just clearly. If he comes here, the fight happens here. People get hurt. The tunnels get found. He looked at Dragon. I go out. I keep him occupied. The island clears. Dragon was quiet for 3 seconds, which was a long time for Dragon. And after the island clears? Then I stop being occupied, Luffy said. Dragon held his gaze. The morning light was coming up gray and cold in Dragon's face, and it was the face of someone who had spent 15 years building a wall between caring about the mission and caring about his son, and who was standing at the wall right now understanding that it was shorter than he made it. He'll be at full capacity, Dragon said. Light speed movement. Logia intangibility. He will not hold back. I know. You've never fought anyone at that level. I know that too. Luffy reached up and pulled his hat down. But he hasn't fought me either. Dragon said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Don't let him dictate the terrain. I won't. And Luffy. Dragon's voice didn't change register. It stayed exactly the same, level, measured, the voice of a man who had spent his entire adult life keeping everything in its place. Be careful. Luffy looked at his father. He registered the weight of those two words coming from that voice, from that face, knowing what they cost and what they meant, and what Dragon had never been willing to say directly until right now. He smiled. Not the reckless grin, not the performance of confidence. Something quieter than that. I'll come back, he said. I always come back. He left before Dragon could respond, which was either tactical or merciful, probably both. Sabo caught up with him at the dock, running, his coat still only half on. I'm coming, he said. No, Luffy said. Luffy, you're staying to manage the evacuation. Luffy kept walking. Koala runs the routes, but people are scared when something like this happens, and scared people make mistakes. You're better at keeping people calm than anyone on this island except Dragon, and Dragon has other things to do. Sabo grabbed his arm and Luffy stopped. They looked at each other. Sabo's jaw was set, and his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was working through an argument he already knew he was going to lose. The careful analytical process of someone who needed to finish the logic even when the conclusion was predetermined. You don't know what he'll do, Sabo said. Nobody knows what anyone will do until they do it, Luffy said. That's the whole thing about a fight. That's not reassuring. It wasn't supposed to be reassuring. Luffy pulled his arm free, not hard, just firm. He looked at Sabo for a moment, at his brother, the word as true and plain as any word he owned. Get everyone out safe. Sabo held the look. Then he exhaled once, sharp and controlled, the sound of someone accepting something they can't change. Bring my souvenir back, he said. Luffy laughed. He was already moving. He took the small scout boat, the fastest thing in the dock, and cleared the harbor just as the marine frigate came alongside the island's northwestern point. He was in open water when the golden light started. It began as a point on the ship's deck, a brightness that didn't belong to the morning, too concentrated and too particular, and then it moved at a speed that his observation registered as real before his eyes confirmed it. A streak of gold, one end on the ship and the other end arrived in front of him before the word arrived had finished forming. Borsalino Kizaru stood on the water. He was a tall man with a mild face, the face of someone's agreeable uncle, softly handsome, wearing a marine admiral's white coat with the ease of a man who had owned nice things so long he'd stopped noticing them. He was looking at Luffy with the particular unfocused benevolence of someone who was not threatened and was being very polite about not being threatened. Oh my, he said. You really are quite young, aren't you? His voice was unhurried, the way everything about him was unhurried. Light moved at 186,000 miles per second and Kizaru moved at the speed of light, and still managed to carry himself like a man who had nowhere specific to be. Luffy stood in the boat. He looked at Kizaru. He thought about Sabo's warning, don't let him dictate the terrain, and about Dragon's, don't let him dictate the terrain. Both of them had said the same thing, which meant it was the right thing. He stretched both arms back and launched himself off the boat and into the air. Kizaru watched him come with mild interest. When Luffy's coated fist arrived where his face should have been, Kizaru was already light, pure gold luminescence, the physical form dissolved and the strike passing through illuminated air. He reformed 3 feet to the left, the mild expression unchanged. My, Kizaru said. That was fast. For your age. He moved. The light kick came from the left and Luffy got his arm up and the armament took it, not fully, the impact carried through even with the coating, and he felt it in his shoulder, a deep concussive force that knocked him sideways in the air. He stretched his arm to the boat, pulled himself back, and the second kick was already there. he went under it. The observation was working, reading Kizaru's intentions at the speed they formed, but the problem with someone who moved at the speed of light was that the gap between intention and arrival was almost nothing. The observation had to be running continuously at full stretch, which it was, but it was the hardest thing he'd done, like trying to read words that were being written and erased simultaneously. He landed on the water, his feet compressing and releasing against the surface in a technique he'd been working on for 2 months, using the rubber properties of his body to distribute his weight across the surface tension in rapid succession, essentially running on water by moving too fast to sink. It wasn't elegant, and it cost a lot of energy, but it gave him a platform. Kizaru settled onto the water beside him with no effort at all, the physics of his movement negotiable in ways that had nothing to do with effort. "You can use haki," Kizaru observed. "That's quite impressive. The color of it is unusual." He tilted his head slightly. "There's something extra in it. Something I don't recognize." The mild face showed its first flicker of genuine interest. "What are you, exactly?" Luffy didn't answer. He came forward again instead, faster this time, not the direct approach but angled, come from one side, change direction in mid-stretch, arrive from somewhere different. His arms went wide, he coiled them in opposite directions and released them simultaneously at Kizaru from 2 angles at once. Kizaru dissolved into light at the point of contact and reformed behind him, and the kick to his back was simultaneous with the reformation, fast enough that there was no gap between appearing and attacking. Luffy hit the water. He came back up immediately, spitting salt water, the armament already reforming on his back where the hit had landed. He could feel the damage. The coating had saved him from the worst of it, but the kinetic force was real and it had been a hard hit. His back ached in the deep way that meant something had been stressed close to its limit. He took stock quickly. Kizaru's light-speed movement made conventional distance control almost meaningless. The Admiral could be anywhere within his line of sight in a fraction of a second, and his Logia intangibility meant direct strikes needed armament coating that was dense enough to force the physical form to take the impact. The challenge was that doing both things simultaneously, maintaining observation at the required depth while landing armament-coated strikes on a target who could become light, was a different order of problem than anything he'd faced before. This was the gap Dragon had been talking about. Kizaru was looking at him with something that was almost fond. "You got back up quickly," he said. "Most people at your level stay down after that." He raised one hand and light gathered at the fingertip, concentrated and sharp. "You should be quite something in 10 years. That's genuinely impressive." The light sharpened further. "It's a shame about the timing." The laser came. Luffy moved, not away from it but through a stretch, his torso going rubber flat, the beam passing through the gap where his center mass had been. He felt the heat of it close enough that the air burned. He came back to full extension, already moving, already closing the distance, and he hit Kizaru's body with an armament-coated elbow at full compression. Kizaru took it. The Admiral took the hit. Not dissolved into light, didn't avoid it, took it, the armament connecting with his physical form with a deep, solid concussion that Luffy felt all the way up his arm. Kizaru rocked back 6 inches. The mild expression flickered. Then he smiled slightly, and it was different from the benevolent smile. More honest. "Oh," Kizaru said. "That's interesting." He exploded into light from every direction simultaneously. The next 4 minutes were the hardest thing Luffy had ever done. Not the hardest physically, though physically it was brutal, the kind of engagement where every hit landed and every hit was significant, and the armament was being asked to hold against something that moved faster than nerve signals. The hardest thing he'd ever done because it required him to be in 2 completely different places at once mentally, one part reading Kizaru's movements at the observation's maximum depth, tracking the light speed transitions between positions, and the other part managing his body, making the adjustments the observation demanded, coordinating the gear techniques with the defensive requirements. It was like being asked to read and write simultaneously. Different brain functions. Different timing. He'd never been asked to do both at full capacity before because nothing had ever required both at full capacity at the same time. He took 3 more hits. One to the shoulder, one that grazed his side and burned through the coat, one that connected with his guard and drove him back across 20 feet of water. Each one hurt. Each one was going to leave something to remember later. But he was learning. The observation was building a model of Kizaru's movement pattern, not the randomness of it, because it wasn't random, it just looked random because the transitions happened too fast to see. But they had logic. Physics. Even light moved according to physics, and physics had patterns, and Luffy's observation was finding them the way it found everything, through accumulation and recognition and the particular deep instinct that the throne had made something more than instinct. On the 5th exchange he got there a quarter second before Kizaru did. Not to the kick. To where the kick was going to be, which was different. He was already coiling when Kizaru's light form arrived, already compressed, already releasing, and the strike connected not with Kizaru mid-movement but with Kizaru arriving, the moment of reformation, the instant of physical solidity. Kizaru went horizontal across the water. He recovered quickly, the light form catching himself mid-tumble and coalescing upright 10 feet away. He was still intact, still clearly in control, but the mild expression had changed in a way that was more substantive now. Something behind the benevolence had sharpened. "You're timing my reformation," Kizaru said. "You have a tell," Luffy said. "Do I?" Kizaru tilted his head. Genuinely curious. "I'm not sure anyone has ever told me that. Your light converges to the left of center before you solidify," Luffy said. "About a fraction before you arrive. It's very small." Kizaru looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously. "You know," he said, "I came here to assess and neutralize a threat. That was the operational directive." He raised his hand and light began gathering again, but different this time, more concentrated, more serious. The playful quality was gone. "But I think the directive may have been written by people who didn't have sufficient information." The light expanded. Not a laser this time, a full projection, blinding and vast, the Admiral releasing his full output into the space between them. Luffy felt the observation scream with the information of it, the heat and force and the particular way that much concentrated light destroyed the normal visual and sensory landscape. He closed his eyes. Not because the light blinded him, the observation didn't use eyes. He closed them because the visual information was interference, noise drowning out the signal he needed, and with them closed the observation was cleaner. He could feel Kizaru in the light, the physical form moving through it, the intention forming, now. He moved. The compression was the deepest he'd ever gone. His whole body coiled into itself, the rubber stretching past any previous limit, the armament coating everything, and he felt the warmth of the throne in his chest flare up in a way it hadn't before. Not the quiet breathing presence of the past months but something urgent, something saying now in the same language as his own heartbeat. The gear technique released and he moved through the light column and his fist connected with Kizaru's physical form at the point of impact with everything behind it. The gears, the haki, the 6 years of the throne building in him, all of it expressed in one strike. The light went out. The water around them was still. The Admiral stood 15 feet away, one hand at his side, his coat's surface disturbed in a way that would resolve into a visible impact crater on the fabric. He was looking at Luffy with an expression that had moved all the way past the mild face and the sharpened face into something plain. He was looking at Luffy the way Dragon looked at difficult things. Like a fact he was going to have to incorporate. Luffy stood on the water, breathing hard. He could feel the damage from the engagement. His shoulder was going to be a problem. His side where the graze had caught him was burning steadily. And there was a deep muscle fatigue in his armament arm that told him the coating had been working at its limit for the last 4 minutes. He was not uninjured. He was not fresh. But he was standing. "You should leave," Luffy said. Kizaru looked at him. The pause before he spoke was longer than any previous pause. "The island has been evacuated by now, I assume," Kizaru said. "Mostly. The people you're protecting are safe." "Mostly," Luffy said again. Kizaru was quiet. He looked at the horizon, then back at Luffy, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone conducting an honest internal assessment. "I was sent to neutralize a threat," he said, "and the honest answer is that I haven't done that. I've had an engagement with an extraordinary anomaly that the intelligence community has completely failed to characterize correctly, and I'm in the position of having to decide whether to escalate or withdraw and file a report that no one in the Senate is going to believe." He looked at Luffy's face, at the hat, at the burning graze on his side and the set of his shoulders and the expression that had not included fear for the duration of the entire engagement. "How old are you?" he asked. 15, Luffy said. Kizaru looked at the sky. He looked back. Something moved across his face that was impossible to name precisely, something in the complex space between his professional function and whatever was happening in the part of him that was a person rather than an admiral. "Dragon's son," he said. "Dragon raised you." "Yes." "And the other thing? The thing in your hockey?" He paused. "That's not Dragon's." "No," Luffy said. "That's mine." Another long pause. Kizaru said, "The report I file will say we had an inconclusive engagement, and the target could not be located at the island." Luffy looked at him. "Why?" "Because filing an accurate report would require explaining what I observed, and what I observed would generate a response that I'm not certain serves anyone's interests." He was quiet for a moment. "I follow the world government's directives, young man. I have done so for decades. But I also have eyes, and what I can see is that the direction this is heading is not going to go the way anyone in Marihoa thinks it's going to go." He let out a slow breath. "I'm not sure destroying you today changes anything meaningful. I'm not sure destroying you today is even something I'm certain I could accomplish." Luffy said nothing. He waited. "I'll withdraw," Kizaru said. "Today." He raised one hand, and the light gathered around him. "But we'll meet again. And next time the directive will be clearer, and the circumstances will be different." "I know," Luffy said. "Make sure you're ready." "I am ready," Luffy said. Kizaru looked at him one last time. Then he smiled, not the mild smile, not the sharp one. Something genuine and slightly sad. "Yes," he said quietly. "I can see that." He became light. The streak crossed the water toward the marine frigate in an instant, and the ship turned and began to move, and within 20 minutes it was gone from Luffy's range of sensing, north-northwest, back the way it had come. Luffy stood on the water for a moment after it was gone. He breathed. He assessed the damage, shoulder, side, the arm fatigue. All manageable. Nothing he couldn't work with. He thought about what Kizaru had said, about what the Admiral had chosen to do and why, about the complexity of someone who served a corrupt system and knew it, and kept serving it anyway, not from cowardice but from a kind of tragic pragmatism, the belief that the alternative was worse. He thought about what it meant that a man like that had looked at him and chosen withdrawal instead of escalation. Then he stretched his arm to the scout boat, 30 feet behind him, and pulled himself back aboard. He sat in the stern, let his breathing steady, and looked at the sky. Something was different. Not outside, inside. The warmth in his chest was different. The throne's presence, the thing that had been breathing in him since the cave, had changed quality in the last few minutes in a way he hadn't had space to register during the fight. It was still warm. Still his. But it was closer to the surface. Like it had come up from wherever it had been sitting to watch what had just happened, and having watched, had decided something. He put his hand flat on his own chest. He could feel it, not the heartbeat, underneath the heartbeat. A different rhythm. Ancient and deep and specifically his, a pulse that had been waiting for proof that the waiting was over. "Okay," he said. To himself, to the water, to the thing in his chest. "I hear you." He started back for the island. Sabo met him at the dock. The evacuation was complete. Luffy had known from his observation that the tunnels had cleared halfway through the fight, which had made the second half easier. The part of his mind that needed to know the people he cared about were safe freed up for other uses. The island was quiet now in the particular way of a place that had just discharged enormous tension, the afternoon light coming down golden and clean. Sabo looked at him. At the burned side of his coat, the shoulder, the way he was moving. His face did something careful and controlled. "The Admiral?" he said. "He left," Luffy said. "Left. He decided it wasn't worth it." Luffy stepped off the boat. His shoulder protested the movement, and he didn't make a sound about it. "I'll explain it all to Dragon later. The full assessment." He looked at Sabo. "The island? Everybody's okay," Sabo said. "B is furious. Ivankov redirected 3 panicking trainees into a conga line somehow, and everyone followed him out of the tunnels, which I did not anticipate but won't question." Luffy almost laughed. "Almost. Good." Sabo was still looking at him with the expression he'd been holding since Luffy stepped off the boat. "Your side," he said. "Graze. Heat-based. It's not deep. Your shoulder. Structural impact. I'll work it out." "Luffy." Sabo said his name like a period at the end of something. He crossed his arms. "Tell me what happened." Luffy looked at him. He thought about where to start, the tale in Kizara's light, the 4 minutes of being dismantled and learning from the dismantling, the strike through the light column, Kizara's face changing, the conversation after. He thought about what to leave out, and realized he wasn't going to leave anything out because this was Sabo. "Come on," he said. "I'll tell you while B patches me up. She's going to want to do it anyway." They walked together toward the medical building, Luffy talking, Sabo listening with the focused attention that meant he was cataloging everything, building his own model of what had happened and what it meant, and what needed to happen next. The evening was coming in over Moonscar, orange light on the rock faces, the smell of the sea, the particular quality of a day that had required everything and was now allowing rest. Dragon was standing outside the medical building. He looked at Luffy walking toward him. He looked at the damaged coat, the burn, the shoulder. He looked at Luffy's face. Luffy looked back. "He left," Luffy said. Dragon said nothing for a moment. He took in the damage with the systematic scan of a man who had been running risk assessments for 20 years. Then his eyes came back to his son's face and he said, "Are you hurt?" "Yes," Luffy said honestly. "But not badly." Dragon nodded once. He stepped aside to let Luffy into the medical building, and as Luffy passed him, Dragon's hand came down on his shoulder, the good shoulder, and stayed there for a second longer than the one at Tequila Wolf had. Not brief. Not passing. Present. Luffy stopped. He looked at his father's hand on his shoulder, and he looked at his father's face. Dragon was looking forward, not at him, his jaw set and his expression doing its controlled work. But his hand was still there. "Dad," Luffy said. Dragon looked at him. "I'm okay," Luffy said. Dragon's hand tightened once on his shoulder. Then it released and Dragon stepped back and said, "Get that side looked at. B is going to want to use the salve and you're going to argue about the salve, and I'm telling you now, use the salve." Luffy smiled. "Okay." He went inside. Dragon stood outside the door for a moment in the evening light. Sabo was beside him, not speaking, which was the right call, which Sabo always knew. "The observation," Dragon said. "You sensed the Admiral early this morning." "He sensed something from the north-northwest," Sabo said. 3 weeks ago. I didn't know what it was, but I noted it." Dragon was quiet. "And the throne," he said. "Did it? I don't know yet," Sabo said. "But something changed. I could feel it from the dock when he came back. The quality of his presence, I don't have a better word. It's different." Dragon looked at the door. "Different how?" he said. Sabo thought about it. "Closer," he said. "Like something that was deep has come up near the surface." Dragon absorbed that. He looked at the western cliff in the falling light, at the dark seam that was the cave entrance, which he could not see from here but knew exactly where to look for. Inside the medical building, Luffy was arguing about the salve with exactly the energy of someone who was not seriously hurt, and was pleased about it. Dragon turned toward his office. He had a report to write about today's events for the Army's intelligence archive, and the report needed to be honest about what had happened and what it meant was large enough that writing it was going to take a while. He would do it carefully. He stopped once, halfway across the courtyard, and looked back at the medical building. Just once. The sound of Luffy's voice came through the wall, not the words, just the sound of it, alive and present and argumentative in the way of someone who had stood in front of an admiral and come back standing. Dragon faced forward and kept walking. The evening settled over Moonscar. In the cave below the cliff, the light was doing something it had never done before, not the breathing rhythm, not the pulse of the past months. Something with more urgency. Something that matched, beat for beat, the changed thing in Luffy's chest. The tide was coming in. It had been coming in for a long time. The shore didn't know it yet. 3 days later, Luffy went to the cave alone. He went at midday, which was unusual. He'd always gone at dawn or dusk, drawn by the quality of the light at those hours, the way the cave's internal glow was most visible when the outside world was transitioning. Midday was stark. Everything was clear. He climbed down the cliff in the direct sun, the water below blue and bright, and he went inside. The chamber was different. The crystal formation was different, not in shape but in quality. The light from it was not the breathing rhythm or the urgency of recent days. It was still. The stillness of something ready. He sat in front of it. He didn't put his hands on it this time. He just sat. He thought about Kizaru's face when he'd landed the strike through the light column. He thought about Dragon's hand on his shoulder. He thought about Viola on the boat looking at the sea. He thought about Sabo running the cliff path every morning, pushing the line of when tired becomes unable, alone and methodical and deeply committed to being worthy of the life he'd found. He thought about what he wanted. Not in the abstract, not freedom as a concept, a principle, a revolutionary's word. He thought about what he wanted when he looked at the people on Moonscar. What he wanted when he thought about Tequila Wolf and Dressrosa. What he wanted when he thought about every chain he'd touched and every face he'd seen in a cell looking at the door. He wanted the world to be larger than it was. He wanted the walls to come down. He wanted every person who had been told their life was someone else's property to stand up and find out that the person who told them that was wrong, and had always been wrong, and was about to find out how wrong. He wanted to be the proof of it. The warmth in his chest expanded. He didn't fight it, and he didn't direct it. He just let it come. The light in the crystal went from still to blazing. Something very old opened its eyes. Luffy breathed in. He came out of the cave 2 hours later. Dragon was sitting at the top of the cliff. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at his son, at the way Luffy moved climbing up, at his eyes, at whatever it was that Sabo had described as closer to the surface. He looked at all of it, and filed it, and said, after a moment, "Well?" Luffy sat beside him on the cliff edge. They looked at the water together. The afternoon was warm and clear, and the sea below them was the particular deep blue of the Grand Line when it was being agreeable. "It's ready," Luffy said. "The form," Dragon said. "Yeah." Dragon was quiet. "Did it happen?" "Not yet," Luffy said. "It will. I know when it will." He looked at his father. "When it needs to. Like Sabo said?" Dragon looked at the sea. Something moved across his face, not the controlled mask, not the mission face. The other one. The one that appeared rarely and briefly and meant that he was standing very close to the wall between caring about the mission and caring about his son, and the wall was not as high as it used to be. "I owe you something," Dragon said. Luffy looked at him. "I have not been." Dragon stopped. He started again. "The way I raised you was shaped by what I needed. What the revolution needed. That's not." He stopped again. The words were coming out less cleanly than Dragon's words usually came out, which meant they were more true than Dragon's words usually were. "You deserved a father who was present in ways I was not." The sea moved below them. Somewhere a bird called. You were present, Luffy said. Not in the ways that counted. Luffy looked at his father. He thought about training yards at 5 in the morning. He thought about that's a perceptive observation said to a 4-year-old. He thought about a man sitting at the edge of a cave while his son touched ancient light, not intervening, just witnessing, understanding that some processes only needed presence, not direction. You were always there, Luffy said. Even when you were being bad at it, you were there. That counts. Dragon looked at him. The wall did something. Not collapse. Dragon's walls didn't collapse, they were part of his architecture. But something shifted behind the stone. You're a better person than I am, Dragon said. I learned from you, Luffy said. I'm not saying I learned how to be good from you, Luffy said. I'm saying I learned what I was fighting for from you. And that gave me enough ground to stand on to figure out the rest myself. He looked at the water. That's actually a lot. Dragon was quiet for a very long time. Below them, the sea went about its ancient business, indifferent to everything. Marineford, Dragon said. I know, Luffy said. It's time. I know that too. Dragon stood. He looked at the horizon. At the long shape of the future that he had been building toward for 20 years, not the personal future that had never been the driver. The systemic future. The world after the chains. He looked at it, and felt the particular complex weight of a man who had spent his whole life aiming at a target now standing close enough to feel the heat of it. He looked down at his son, sitting on the cliff edge. I'll go with you, Dragon said. Luffy looked up at him with genuine surprise, not the expression of a child surprised, but of someone who had not expected this specific thing. He thought about it for a second. Then he shook his head. I need to do this part myself, he said. But meet me after. Dragon looked at him. He held the look long enough that it meant something. After, he said. Luffy grinned. Chapter 6. King of all dragons. Marineford had seen wars. The bay remembered them, the stone walls remembered the weight of cannon fire, the plaza remembered the particular way blood looked on white marble. The execution platform remembered what it meant to be the center of the world's attention. The fortress had been built to be the fulcrum of power, the place where the world government demonstrated, regularly and without apology, that there were limits to what was possible and that the limits were enforced here, at the end of a gun, at the base of a scaffold. It had seen wars. It had not seen this. Luffy arrived on a Thursday, in broad daylight, on a ship that flew no flag. He came alone. No army behind him, no fleet, no revolutionary forces positioned in the bay. Just the ship and the morning and the particular quality of his observation stretching out ahead of him, reading the fortress the way he read everything, not strategically, just honestly, taking in what was there. He felt the Marines before he could see them. Thousands of them, deployed in the concentric defensive rings that Marineford used for high alert configuration. He felt the admirals, 3 of them, which meant Kizaru had not kept the inconclusive engagement completely to himself, which Luffy had assumed. He felt the warlords on the perimeter, 4 of them, each one a distinct signature in his observation, each one enormous in the way that real power was enormous, unmistakable. He felt Garp. He'd known Garp would be here. Dragon had mentioned him exactly once, a month ago, in the clinical way Dragon mentioned difficult things. Your grandfather, the hero of the Marines, will likely be present. He knows who you are. He's known since the beginning. What he does with that information is his own calculation. Dragon had said nothing else about it, and Luffy had not asked, because some things were complete in the saying of them. He felt Dragon too, which was not a surprise. Dragon was in the city, not inside Marineford, but in Marineford town, the civilian port that spread outward from the fortress's eastern face. Present, as promised. After. Luffy came into the harbor. The Marine response was immediate, and by the numbers, 6 ships moving to intercept positions, the fortress's outer guns swinging to bearing, a broadcast through the communication system that identified the approaching vessel and issued a formal warning to heave to and prepare for boarding. The broadcast was professional and precise, and Luffy let it happen while he sat on the bow of his ship and watched the fortress come closer and thought about what he was going to say. He'd thought about it for a month. Not scripted. He didn't script things. Dragon had tried that approach twice and abandoned it both times because Luffy's scripts dissolved in the first 30 seconds of any real situation, and what came out instead was always more true than what had been planned. He'd thought about the intention of it. The specific thing he was here to do, which was not a battle and not a negotiation. A statement. Dragon had called it that weeks ago. Luffy had a better word now. A demonstration. He stood up. The harbor was close now, 200 yards, the guns of Marineford at maximum targeting resolution, 6 marine ships forming a box around him, the fortress walls lined with soldiers. He stood on the bow and let the observation expand, full reach, no ceiling, and he felt the whole of Marineford in one breath, every soldier's heartbeat, every admiral's attention. Garp standing on the east parapet with his arms crossed and his face set in something that wasn't anger, and wasn't grief, and wasn't easily named. He felt all of them. He let them feel him back. That was new. Not something he'd done before, not something he'd known he could do until this morning, standing at the wheel of the ship in the pre-dawn dark and reaching out, and finding that his observation wasn't just receiving anymore. It had mass. It had presence. When he extended it fully and let it settle over a space, the people in that space felt it the way you felt weather, a pressure, a weight, a change in the quality of the air. He let it settle over Marineford. The broadcast stopped mid-sentence. That was interesting. He heard it cut off in the fortress's communication room, felt the operator's confusion, felt the ripple of unease move through the thousands of Marines on the walls and in the plaza like a wave moving through water. Not panic. These were professional soldiers, trained for high-stress environments. But unease. The particular unease of something you've trained for all your life suddenly feeling insufficient for the specific thing in front of you. The 6 ships slowed. Luffy jumped. He launched himself off the bow with both arms stretched back to the hull, the compression enormous, the release total, and he cleared the 6 ships and the harbor wall and landed in the center of Marineford's execution plaza with a single impact that sent a visible shockwave out across the stone in every direction. He stood up straight. He put his hat on. He looked around. The plaza was ringed, thousands of Marines above him on the walls and tiers, the admirals at 3 points on the upper level, warlords in their positions, the whole architecture of the world government's military power arranged around one open stone square with him standing in the middle of it. It was an extraordinary amount of force aimed at one 15-year-old in a straw hat. Luffy thought it was almost funny. "I'm not here to fight," he said. His voice was not amplified, not projected with any special technique. He just spoke at normal volume and let his observation do the work, the mass of his presence carrying the words through the whole fortress the way wind carries sound across water. Every person in Marineford heard him. "I'm here to say something. I'll say it once, and then I'll go, and if anyone wants to stop me from going, that's when we'll fight." Silence. Then Akainu's voice, from the upper tier, hard iron-weighted, the voice of a man who had made his ideology into weather. "You have the audacity to walk into this fortress and expect. I told you I have something to say," Luffy said without heat. He looked up at Akainu. "You'll hear it or you won't. But if you start a fight before I say it, I'll finish the fight and then say it anyway, and that seems like extra work for everyone." Akainu's expression was a controlled thing made of absolute certainty, and the particular fury of someone who genuinely believed they were righteous and was confronted with something that didn't respond to righteousness as a force. He was not stupid. Luffy registered that with the observation, felt the intelligence behind the ideology, the real capability of the man. Akainu was possibly the most dangerous person in this fortress, and he believed completely in what he was, which made him more dangerous still. But he did not attack. Because Kizaru, standing 2 positions over on the upper tier, had said something to him very quietly, and Akainu had heard it, and whatever Kizaru had said had done the work of buying 30 seconds. Luffy looked at Kizaru. Kizaru looked at him with a mild face. "Thank you," Luffy said. Don't thank me yet, Kizaru said pleasantly. Say your thing. Luffy looked at the plaza floor for a moment. He thought about the cave on Moonscar. He thought about white light and something very old deciding he was the answer to its question. He thought about the months since that afternoon on the cliff, the training, the preparation, the specific work of getting ready not for a fight but for this. He thought about Dragon in the city outside, waiting. He thought about what he actually wanted to say, and found that it was simpler than anything he'd spent a month preparing. The world government runs the world, he said. That's just what's true. It runs the trade routes and the laws and the military and the courts, and it decides who's a pirate and who's a criminal and who's free and who isn't. It decides what history happened and what history didn't. It decides which islands get protection and which islands get burned. He looked up at the walls, at the thousands of faces looking down. I know all of this. I grew up learning all of this. My father spent my entire life fighting against all of this. His voice was steady. Not impassioned, the passion was there but underneath, like the throne's warmth was underneath everything, present and foundational rather than showy. But I'm not here because of my father's war, he said. I'm here because of mine. He looked at Garp on the east parapet. The old man was looking back at him with an expression that was enormous and unreadable, a face that had been carrying something complicated since long before Luffy was born, the face of a man who loved his family, and loved his justice, and had never been able to make those two things fit in the same room. I'm not a revolutionary, Luffy said. I don't want to run the world after the government falls. I don't want a different system. I just want there to not be a system. I want people to be able to decide things for themselves. I want the chains to come off, not because some other flag replaced the government's flag, but because chains are wrong. That's the whole reason. That's all of it. He paused. The world government is going to fall, he said. Not because of the Revolutionary Army, though they're part of it. Not because of the Yonko, though they're part of it too. It's going to fall because the thing it's built on, the idea that some people own other people, that some bloodlines are worth more than other bloodlines, that the celestial dragons get to be gods because their ancestors won a war a long time ago, that idea is wrong. And things that are wrong don't last forever. He looked at the walls, at the guns, at the fortress and everything it represented. They last as long as people are afraid to say so. Silence. I'm not afraid to say so, Luffy said. I'm 15 years old and I'm standing in the middle of Marineford saying so, and I want every Marine in this building and every person watching this from a Den Mushy broadcast and every celestial dragon sitting in Marihoa to hear it clearly. He let the observation settle deeper over the space, let his presence fill every corner of the plaza. The age of this system is ending. Not today, not next year. But it's ending. And when it ends, the people who fought to keep it are going to have to explain themselves to a world that remembers exactly what they were protecting. He looked at Akainu. At the man's iron certainty, his real belief, his genuine conviction that what he was protecting was order and that order was better than the alternative. You think you're protecting people, Luffy said directly to him. You believe that. I can see that you believe it. But the people you're protecting the world from? Those are just people who want to be left alone. Who want to make their own choices. Who are tired of being afraid. He held Akainu's gaze. That's not a threat. That's just what people want. And a world that has to use this much force to stop people from wanting that isn't a stable world. It's a held-down world. And held-down things don't stay down. Akainu said nothing. That was the most remarkable thing that had happened since Luffy landed in the plaza. Sakazuki, Fleet Admiral, the man who had burned whole islands to eliminate threats to the world government's order, who did not stop for anyone, said nothing. Not because he agreed. His expression was beyond disagreement. It was the expression of a belief system encountering something it hadn't integrated yet. He was still thinking. Still calculating. The iron certainty was still there, but something had shifted in the space around it, and the shifting needed a moment to resolve. Luffy turned. He faced east, toward the parapet where Garp was standing. The old man hadn't moved. He was still in his crossed arms position, but the arms had tightened slightly, and his face was doing something that the observation registered as enormous and old and full of things that had been carrying for a very long time. "I know who you are," Luffy said to him. "Dragon told me. You're my grandfather." He paused. "You put your duty first your whole life. You chose what you believed in over your own family, over and over. I'm not angry about that." He meant it completely. "But I'm asking you, just once, to listen to this part. To hear it like a person and not like a marine." Garp looked at him. The old man's eyes were wet, which was something none of the assembled military force of the world government had ever seen, and which moved through the crowd like a second shockwave. "The world you've been protecting," Luffy said, "is worth protecting. The people in it are worth protecting. I want that too. I just want them protected from different things than you do." He let the silence hold for a moment. That's all. He was done talking. He stood in the center of the plaza, in the held breath of several thousand people, and he let the intention he'd been carrying since the cave and since Moonscar and since a burning ship and a tag on a wrist and a man raising a boy he hadn't planned for but had anyway, he let it come up from where it had been sitting. The warmth in his chest became heat. The heat expanded. It didn't look like anything at first. Then it looked like light, gold and deep, not Kizaru's light, nothing like Kizaru's clean laser brightness. This was something older. Something that had textures in it, that moved the way deep water moved, that filled the air above the plaza with a quality that made the temperature change and made the stone underfoot hum at a frequency below hearing. The Marines on the walls grabbed for handholds. Not because anything physical happened. Because the weight of the presence expanded, and it was enormous, old enormous, the kind of enormous that the world made when it was reminding you of its actual scale. Luffy's armament rose over his whole body simultaneously, denser than it had ever been, black as absence. And through it the gold light poured, not through gaps in the armament, through the armament itself, like the Haki and the throne power had stopped being separate things and had become one thing, a single expression with two components that held each other up. He grew. Not instantly. The way the text had described, gradually and then all at once, like a tide coming in. He was 15 and 5'8", and then he was larger, and the light was everywhere, and the stone under his feet was cracking in a radial pattern from the pressure of the transformation, and the Marines on the walls were gripping each other, and the admirals had taken defensive positions out of pure reflex even though nothing aggressive was happening. He was 40 feet tall and still going, and the armament was everywhere, and the gold light was the air itself, and above his head two things had appeared that had been in the cave's crystal for longer than the world government had existed. Wings. Not bird wings. Not the wings of anything small or familiar. The wings of something that had crossed the sky no living person had seen, vast and dark and gold at the leading edge, the span of them wider than the execution platform and the plaza combined, the air displacement when they extended for the first time, sending a wave across Marineford that knocked people off their feet on the upper tiers. The Dragon King stood in the center of Marineford. He was not a monster. That was the thing, not the thing Luffy had feared, because Luffy hadn't feared it, but the thing everyone else had feared for him, which was that the transformation would be consuming, that the thing in the cave would swallow the person who let it out. It didn't. He was himself. He was 15 years old and laughing, which was audible even now, the laugh that had no guile in it, the laugh that was a response to the world being exactly as interesting as he'd always thought it was. He looked down at Marineford. At the thousands of upturned faces. At the admirals, Kizaru with his mild face showing genuine wonder, Fujitora with his sightless eyes tilted up and a small smile on his face that suggested his other senses were telling him something his eyes would never see, a kindness standing absolutely still with the iron certainty doing something complicated. At Garp. Garp was looking up at him with both hands at his sides. The old man's face was all the way open, no professional mask, no Marine's control, just a grandfather looking at his grandson and finding that the grandson was so much larger than anything he protected or prevented or planned for that the whole framework of protecting and preventing dissolved into something simpler. Pride. Just that. Old and enormous and helpless, the pride of someone who had nothing to do with what they were looking at and couldn't have stopped themselves feeling it anyway. Luffy looked at his grandfather and let his observation extend to the single point of the old man's face and read it completely. He held the look for 3 seconds. Then he winked. Garp made a sound. One sound, not a word, and then he covered his face with both hands, which was the most emotionally complex thing any person in Marineford had witnessed in their career. He held the form for 60 seconds. Long enough for every Den Den Mushi broadcast to capture it. Long enough for the image to travel, and it would travel. Dragon had been clear about that. The Revolutionary Army's communication network would ensure the image traveled to every island in the Grand Line within 24 hours. The king of all dragons standing in Marineford, wings spanning the execution plaza, gold light in the air above the fortress of the world government. Not a declaration of war. A demonstration. The demonstration he'd been building towards since a cave on a small island and a piece of ancient power asking him the most important question he'd ever been asked. Are you the answer? And he had said, with his training and his hockey and his father's voice and his brother's steadiness, and everything that had been growing in him since before he was old enough to name it, yes. Obviously. Obviously, yes. He let the form go. The gold light retracted. The wings folded and dissolved. The armament receded. He was 15 and 5'8" again, standing in the cracked plaza with the morning light on his face and his hat on his head, and the silence of Marineford was the deepest silence he had ever been inside. He looked at Akainu. I'm going now, he said. Akainu looked at him. The iron certainty had resolved into something he could function with again, not acceptance, not agreement, nothing so simple. Something more like the recognition of a force that had been added to the calculation. This isn't over, Akainu said. I know, Luffy said. But today it is. He stretched one arm to the top of the fortress wall and pulled himself up. He stood on the wall for a moment, looking back at the plaza, at the radial cracks in the stone, at the thousands of still faces, at the admirals, at Garp who had uncovered his face and was looking at him with those wet eyes. Gramps, Luffy said. Garp looked at him. Come have dinner sometime, Luffy said. I'll tell Dragon you're coming. He'll make something. He's actually a good cook, he just pretends not to be because he thinks it's inconsistent with the revolutionary image. The silence lasted 3 more seconds. Then someone on the wall started laughing. A Marine, a junior officer who clapped his hand over his mouth immediately and looked terrified. But the sound was out, and somewhere else in the fortress another person made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to it, and the specific quality of the held breath changed. Not broken tension. Changed tension. Something that had been pure weight becoming something more complex, something with room for the absurd in it, for the fact that the most powerful being any of them had ever stood in the same space as had just invited the hero of the Marines to dinner and offered to reveal that Dragon could cook. Garp made a noise. It was also a laugh, deeply unwilling, quickly suppressed, but honest in a way Garp couldn't fully prevent. Luffy grinned. He jumped. He cleared the harbor wall and the bay and landed on his ship, and the sail was up and the wind was with him, and he was moving before Marineford had fully exhaled. Dragon was in a small square 3 streets from the eastern gate of Marineford town, sitting at an outdoor table with a cup of something hot, which was so domestically ordinary that Luffy stopped for a second when he saw it, and had to recalibrate. Dragon looked up as Luffy came across the square. He looked at his son, at the coat with the new cracks in the boots from the landing, at the hat, at the expression. Well? Dragon said. Luffy sat down across from him. He stretched one arm to a passing bender's cart, and came back with 2 skewers of grilled meat and started eating. Dragon watched this with the expression of a man who had given up on certain battles long ago. It went well, Luffy said between skewers. I felt the form manifest, Dragon said. Quiet, factual. From here. I thought you might. The Den Den Mushi network will have broadcast images within. I know, Luffy said. That was the point. He looked at his father. It'll change things. Maybe not immediately. But it puts something in the world that wasn't there before. He ate. A question. What question? Whether someone like that is possible. Luffy looked at the fortress in the distance, the tops of its towers visible over the city roof lines. People stop accepting things when they can see an alternative. The government tells people the chains are just how things are. That there's no alternative, nothing outside the system, nothing bigger than what they've built. Show people something bigger, and the argument starts breaking down. Dragon was quiet for a moment. He looked at his cup. You learned that from me, he said. Yeah, Luffy said. Good lesson. Dragon looked at him. Then he looked away, at the town around them, the ordinary movement of the morning, people going about things, unaware of what had just happened inside the fortress 600 meters away. Civilians. The people the war was for, whether they knew it or not. Garp? Dragon said. He laughed. Luffy said. Dragon's expression did something complicated and brief. He laughed. Yeah. Luffy finished the first skewer. I invited him to dinner. Told him you were a good cook. Dragon stared at him. You did what? He's my grandfather, Luffy said simply. He is also the man who has spent the last 15 years being a Marine because that's what he believes in, Luffy said. Same as you're a revolutionary because you believe in it. He's not evil, Dragon. He's wrong about some things and right about others, and he's my grandfather, and he was crying when I looked at him. He met his father's eyes. He's family. Dragon was very still. He looked at his son across the table with the cup of something hot between his hands and the morning light on his face, and an expression that was doing more work than any expression Dragon normally allowed himself. You are nothing like me, Dragon said. I'm exactly like you, Luffy said. I'm just more like me too. Dragon looked at him for a long time. The kind of long time that was a whole conversation happening inside one person, private and old and necessary. The morning moved around them, vendors and foot traffic and the ordinary life of a town that didn't know yet what had happened in the fortress nearby. What now? Dragon said. Luffy finished the second skewer. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the sky, the Grand Line sky, enormous and various, the weather systems that lived in it visible on the horizon like suggestions of things to come. Now I go sailing, he said. Dragon blinked. It was the smallest, most genuine expression of surprise Luffy had ever seen on that face. Sailing. I've been on Moonscar my whole life, Luffy said. I've done missions. I've seen pieces of things. But I haven't actually been out there. He looked at the horizon. I want to see the whole thing. The islands, the people, what's actually happening in the world we're trying to change. He paused. I can't change something I don't know. Dragon looked at him. He was working through something, Luffy could see it. The operational mind finding the objections and the strategic mind finding the counters, and somewhere underneath both of them the other thing, the part of Dragon that was not an ideology or a function but a person, arriving at the only honest response. Sabo? Dragon said. He's coming, Luffy said. Obviously. And you'll stay in communication with the network, send intelligence when I find it, not start any wars I can't finish. Luffy looked at his father. I'll come back when something needs me here. But for now, I need to go see it. Dragon was quiet. And you need me out there, Luffy said. Not because you'll tell me what to do. Because what I did in Marineford today, that was a statement. It needs follow-through. Someone out in the world, moving through it, showing people what's possible. The army works from hiding. I don't have to hide anymore. He gestured at himself. There's not much point in hiding after that. Dragon almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth moved. No, he said. There isn't. They sat in the square while the morning moved around them and the town went about its business, and somewhere in Marineford the conversation was already happening, the one that started with what was that and moved toward everything it implied. Luffy could feel it, His observation still broad, still present, reading the quality of the tension in the fortress, and finding it changed in the specific way that things changed when a belief they'd held was challenged. Not broken. Not replaced. Questioned. That was the beginning. Dragon? Luffy said. Come with us. Some of the way. You don't have to. I know the work doesn't stop. But for a week. Come see the thing you've been fighting for from outside the war. Dragon looked at his cup. He was quiet for a long time. A week, he said finally. A week, Luffy confirmed. Dragon set the cup down. He looked at the sky the way Luffy had looked at it, at the Grand Line sky and its weather suggestions and the vast complicated world that existed under it, the world he'd been trying to change from inside a fortress of his own making for 20 years. All right, he said. Luffy grinned. Sabo was waiting at the dock. He'd come separately from Moonscar, the evacuation having concluded cleanly and Koala having confirmed the island's restoration to operational status, and he'd been in Marineford town for 2 hours, which was 2 hours of Sabo absorbing news about the events at the fortress and constructing increasingly detailed analysis that he was clearly dying to deliver. He looked at Luffy walking up with Dragon behind him. He looked at Dragon. He looked back at Luffy. He's coming with us? He said. For a week, Luffy said. Sabo processed this. Dragon is coming sailing with us. For a week. He agreed to it himself, Luffy said. Sabo looked at Dragon with the specific expression of a person reevaluating a model they had held for years. Dragon looked back at him with the expression of a man who had also agreed to something he hadn't done before and was handling it with dignity. The network needs updates every 3 days, Dragon said. Obviously, Sabo said. And there are 3 intelligence nodes in the northern route that need. I know the nodes, Sabo said. I helped set up 2 of them. Dragon looked at him. Something in the look was the closest thing to warmth Dragon directed at people who were not Luffy, which was not nothing. Sabo had been on Moonscar for 6 years. He had been excellent for 6 years. Dragon noticed excellence even when he didn't comment on it. Good, Dragon said. Sabo looked at Luffy. Marineford, he said. Yeah. The form. Yeah. Sabo was quiet for 3 seconds. I want a full account. Everything. From the landing. I'll tell you on the ship, Luffy said. He was already walking up the gangplank, already looking at the water beyond the harbor, the blue immensity of the Grand Line going on beyond what eyes could see. I'll tell you and then you can analyze it to death and I'll listen while you explain why it worked. It worked because on the ship, Luffy said. Sabo followed him up the gangplank. Dragon came behind, and it was that, the 3 of them, father and 2 sons without the formal name for it, that was the shape of the thing boarding the ship in Marineford town on a Thursday morning. Luffy stood at the prow as they cleared the harbor. The sun was full and high now, the morning properly underway, and ahead of them the Grand Line opened up in all its absurd and various immensity. Weather systems on the horizon. Islands in 3 directions. The whole impossible geography of the world they were going to change. He felt it all with the observation, not comprehensively, not in detail, just the general quality of the world being large and full of people doing things that mattered and problems that needed addressing in places that had never been seen and situations that needed someone to walk into them without being afraid. He felt the thing in his chest, the throne's warmth, fully integrated now, no longer beneath the surface. Part of the surface. Part of the skin of him, the breathing of him, as natural as rubber, as natural as laughter. He felt Dragon at the stern, looking at the water, saying nothing, which was Dragon's version of absorbing something good. He felt Sabo beside him, who had been about to say something for the last 30 seconds and was managing it. Say it, Luffy said. The wings, Sabo said. The wingspan was estimated at approximately 60 feet. I calculated it from the tower heights in the accounts I received. Did it feel like yes? Luffy said. You don't know what I was going to ask. You were going to ask if it felt like flying, Luffy said. And it did. Even on the ground. The whole time I held the form it felt like I was already going somewhere. Sabo was quiet. Then he said, "Where?" Luffy looked at the horizon. At the sky above the horizon. At the space above the sky where the world ran out of architecture and became something that was nobody's territory. "Everywhere," he said. The ship moved. Behind them, Marineford sat with its questions. With its cracks in the plaza stone. With Garp standing on the east parapet for a long time after, looking at the place where his grandson had stood and done something that had no category, that no report would adequately describe, that no response would adequately address, because it had not been an attack or a threat or a declaration in any form the fortress knew how to respond to. It had been a fact. A new fact, installed in the world, permanent and growing. Ahead of them the Grand Line went on, islands and weather and people and chains and the slow turning of a world that was beginning, in the small dark spaces where change first lives before it becomes visible, to ask the question that ends systems. The question that starts with what if, and ends with why not. The ship moved and the morning went with it, and Dragon at the stern breathed sea air, and Sabo said 17 more analytical things about the wingspan, and Luffy laughed at all of them and meant it. He was 15 years old. He was the king of all dragons. He was just getting started.